So good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our physical and our virtual participants to this second day of the third annual Forum on Endocrine Disruptors, organised and hosted by the European Commission DG Environment. Now, we do have interpretation into French, Italian, Spanish, and German, one-way interpretation, so do make sure that you are listening in the language of your choice. And a note to the speakers who are joining remotely, please do use headsets with mics. That really helps us here. So my name is Katrina Sickle. I'm a moderator and broadcaster, and I'm based this afternoon at the Charlemagne building in Brussels. Now, you know it's the second day. We have a host of fabulous speakers, as we did yesterday. And just a reminder, or perhaps for the first time if you weren't here yesterday, this forum provides this great platform to discuss the follow-up actions on endocrine disruptors in the chemical strategy for sustainability. Now, that was, of course, adopted in autumn last year and already presented at last year's forum. Now, yesterday we mainly focused upon technical aspects. Today we're going to shift slightly and move towards regulatory aspects. We're going to hear more from the EU and from its agencies. Just a couple of things from yesterday which really did stand out for me. We had a great session on the impact of EDs from prenatal development to adulthood. So we looked at all of that impact cross-generationally, across life stages, and it really was sobering and very compelling. And we looked at issues of obesity and behavioral disorders and really some very interesting areas. We also heard from the JRC on a thyroid validation study, which is going to terminate next year. That was fascinating. Test methods from the OECD. We heard from the Orion cluster, and particularly the importance of focusing on effects as much as exposure and biomonitoring, but there were a lot of recommendations that came from the Orion cluster there. And we also heard very interestingly, right at the start from the Human Biomonitoring for Europe programme, all about the complexity of obtaining diverse exposure data and also the complexity of the assessment of real-world chemical mixtures. So that was just a few highlights. We're going to have more fabulous insights and experts talking to you today. Again, the numbers are climbing up to 200. I hope we'll get more than 200 people with us. We stayed solid, but definitely it's quite a spread. We have 40 plus countries representing 5 continents. So may I first say on behalf of all of us here, thank you so much. Stay with us on this journey. Why? Because every session is a piece of the puzzle, so you definitely want to hear right up until the end, and you get to make your voice heard on Twitter at any time, hashtag Endocrine Disruptors. That's one way. But in every session, we give you the opportunity to pose a question. You can do that in the chat channel on the platform. I'll take them after each speaker has presented. Golden rule in English, super short, say to whom your question is addressed, if there's more than one person in a session, and of course, who you are. Couple of last pointers, and I promise I'll move on. Very importantly, slides will be available after the event, but also a summary report. So if you think you've missed something, something was particularly interesting for you, all of those speakers will check that report before it comes to you. That's it. We've got a great kickoff today. It's a very, very rich program. You can take a break at 4 o'clock for half an hour. But before that, I have great pleasure in inviting to join me on the stage our opening speaker from the European Commission, DG Environment, Head of Unit Sustainable Chemicals, Christina De Avila. Welcome. I'm doing that great moving act. So it's going to be your moment. So welcome. Thank you so much. You're going to be working quite hard today because you're here now. And then I'm going to ask you right back at the end to join me again because you're going to be listening in. But as I understand it, I'm going to let you present. You've got some things that you need to say. And after about 25 minutes, I'll pop back. I've got a couple of questions and we'll see what comes in from the audience. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katarina, and thank you for the introduction, for the summary of yesterday's discussions that give the necessary perspective to the work that we are undertaking in the Commission and that we are going to be discussing this afternoon. So first of all, I would like to recall the purpose of the chemicals strategy for sustainability. We already had a presentation in last year's forum about the chemicals strategy, in which we looked in detail to all the different aspects that were covered there. But today I want just to recap a bit on what was the purpose of the chemicals strategy for sustainability, where we set out a vision towards a toxic-free environment, so that by 2030, chemicals are produced and used in a way that maximizes their benefits to society while we are avoiding the harm to the planet and current and future generations. In order to make this vision a reality, we have established in the strategy 5 building blocks, 2 overarching objectives, which are innovation and competitiveness, and strengthening legislation for achieving a higher level of protection, and 3 key enablers, which are simplification and coherence, knowledge and science, and the global dimension. The strategy also contains a large number of actions, more than 80. Actions with relevance for endocrine disruptors can be found across the 5 building blocks. We'll try to give an overview today of the main actions of the chemicals strategy that concern endocrine disruptors, either specifically or more horizontally. So in terms of strengthening legislation, for a start, we want to make sure that all chemicals on the market are used safely and sustainably. We want to ensure that substances of concern are substituted and their use is minimized. And in terms of the most harmful chemicals, we want to ensure that they are no longer used in consumer products, in particular in those that are addressed to vulnerable groups. To achieve this, we need to strengthen our legislation. EDs are targeted by these actions, and in the next slides, I will explain how we go about it. So first, we need to ensure that we are identifying properly substances that have endocrine disrupting properties. So we will need to revise the regulation on classification, labeling, and packaging of chemicals to introduce endocrine disruption as a new hazard class. I will explain a bit later in detail where we are with the development of the endocrine disruption hazard class, but it is important to mention that in this amendment of the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation, we will also be including other new hazard classes that will be for substances that are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, and substances that are persistent, mobile, and toxic. Second, we have the REACH regulation, where we plan a revision, a targeted revision that is called upon in the strategy, and in all, that will affect all the main processes in REACH, so registration, evaluation, authorizations, restrictions. In the registration process, we will update the mandatory information requirements, and in particular for endocrine disruptors. I will explain also that in more detail in a minute. But we will also do other actions, such as the introduction of the mystery assessment factor in the legislation, in particular in the chemical safety assessment. This is quite important for endocrine disruptors because at the moment it's not possible to evaluate the combination of several endocrine disrupting substances from a regulatory point of view. Following the introduction of the new hazard classes in the CLP regulation, this will also be reflected in the list of substances of very high concern that affect the authorization process. So there is a call in the chemicals strategy to amend the REACH Article 57 to include, among substances of very high concern, endocrine disruptors in their own right. Today, we can identify, and we have identified, endocrine disruptors through Article 57 of REACH, through identification of an equivalent level of concern to CMRs. In the future, this will not be like this, and they will have their own entry. The same will be the case for substances that are very persistent, mobile, and toxic, and very persistent and very, very mobile. They will have their own entry in Article 57. Like this, we will create a legal link between the list of substances of very high concern and the CLP regulation. And this, we will avoid duplication of work and ensure coherence, such as the coherence and synergies of the work that we've ensured for CMRs throughout the years. For restrictions, at the moment, we already have a mechanism in REACH that ensures that when substances are identified as carcinogen, mutagen, or reprotoxicants, they can be automatically banned in consumer products. In REACH, we have these automatic restrictions, normally for substances that are sold directly to consumers or in mixtures. And this is what we call generic approach to risk management. It's also featuring in other pieces of legislation, not only in REACH. So the idea is to extend the approach in two ways in REACH. One, by including new hazard classes in this approach, such as endocrine disruptors and persistent and bioaccumulative substances. In a second step, we will include other hazard classes, such as immunotoxicants, neurotoxicants, respiratory sensitizers, and STOT. But we also want to extend the scope of the generic approaches, not only to cover consumer products, but also to cover products for professional use. These risk management measures will bring more protection for consumers and professionals. It is important also to point out that while we are extending the risk management, the generic risk management approach, we'll also be introducing the concept of essential uses. So if a chemical, that it's an endocrine disruptor, but its function in a consumer product is essential for health, safety, or the functioning of society, and there are no acceptable alternatives, it will still be able to be used. Regarding the timelines, you will see on the slide that we are now working on the supporting actions and studies that will feed into our impact assessment, which is the necessary tool that has to accompany any Commission proposal. We are aiming to publish the Commission proposal at the end of 2022, in line with the commitment of the strategy. Another important change that we are working on is the One Substance, One Assessment process. This is a new process that we intend to make safety assessment simpler, faster, and more transparent, more consistent, and more predictable. The idea is to avoid situation where a substance is considered hazardous is identified as having a hazard class under CLP, and it's addressed in one piece of legislation, but not in another one, which is the case today for endocrine disruptors. There are a number of actions under the One Substance, One Assessment that will, of course, have relevance for endocrine disruptors. The update of the CLP regulation to include the new hazard classes is one action that is considered to fall under the One Substance, One Assessment. But a number of actions, like try to coordinate action in piece of legislation that take risk management measures, is also of relevance for endocrine disruptors. Having a clear allocation of tasks, trying to as far as possible, allocate the tasks to the agencies to make best use of the available resources and expertise, as well as important actions in terms of transparency and communication, such as having a repository of limit-based values, as well as the open data platform. And finally, the last key enabler in the chemical strategy is the global dimension, which is also very important for endocrine disruptors. At the international level, we will contribute to promoting the use of the the globally harmonized system for classification, so the GHS, and we will also bring there the new hazard classes, especially the new ED hazard class that will be included at the European level in the CLP regulation. So those were the big lines of the goals in the strategy. I will now want to go down into more level of detail. So for the CLP and the revision and introduction of the new hazard class for endocrine disruptors, we already have had some discussions with experts in member states and with the stakeholders. We have a draft proposal that was first discussed in March 2021 with our expert group for REACH and CLP, which is called the Caracal. We have a subgroup there that is focusing on endocrine disruptors, and we brought this draft proposal for discussion there. The second discussion happened last week on the 13th of September. What I can say about our proposal is that it's based on the WHO definition and builds on the criteria that already exist for pesticides and biocides. The idea with introducing this new hazard class in CLP is that it will be applicable across legislation. So, when looking at the new endocrine disruptor hazard class, we had a number of discussions how to go about it. First, we concluded that it was best to have separate classes for human health and for the environment, because the legislation regulating the use of chemicals sometimes have different scopes. For example, the cosmetics regulation only covers health and not the environment. So like this, we can serve better those pieces of legislation that will need to build on the classification through CLP. We also propose to include a categorization system, similar to the one that we already have for CMRs in classification, labeling, and packaging. Here we'll are looking basically into two categories, known and presumed, and then suspected. This, for us, is important because it better reflects science and the certainty that the scientists have on the classification of the substance, and enables a more nuanced response from the point of view of the risk management measures. In addition to the hazard classes, the two hazard classes and the categorization system, we are thinking about having new label elements, in particular the H and the P statements, so the hazard and the precautionary statements. Of course, as whenever we present a proposal in the legislative proposal in the Commission, we are planning an impact assessment before presenting our proposal. The aim is to identify and assess the effects that the various options are expected to have, the impact on health, on environment, the social impact, the economic impact, and the impact in the internal market. The input of stakeholders is crucial on these topics, and therefore there will be stakeholder consultations. We started the consultation processes already at the beginning of this month with the consultation of the Inception Impact Assessment, formerly called the Roadmap. We also carry out a supporting study, in particular, to estimate the number of substances that will fall under each of the hazard categories. And this could be used in the review process for each piece of downstream legislation. It is important to note that we want to strike the right balance. We do not want to overclassify, but we also do not want to underclassify. So, as I said, we are still discussing at Commission level the criteria in the context of developing the impact assessment. We expect the Commission proposal to come out in 2022, at the beginning of 2022. In terms of the next step after the adoption of the criteria under CLP, we will propose the adoption of new endocrine disruptor classification under the globally harmonized system, under the UN, as a new building block. And finally, once the criteria there, other pieces of legislation will be capable of integrating the new hazard classes in the risk management measures. So we move on over to REACH and the update of the REACH information requirements. So it has become clear in the fitness check, also in the REACH evaluation procedure, that REACH was ineffective with regard to mandatory information requirements on endocrine disruptors. In particular, we've had concerns from some substances on their possible endocrine disrupting properties, and we looked more closely at them in the REACH evaluation process, where we realized there was the need for additional tests, for which ECHA then had to ask the companies that had registered the substances. The important feature of information requirements is that they need to be sufficient to allow risk assessment and to allow classification. The information requirements are there, obviously, to make possible to use properly and to operationalize the new hazard classes that we'll have under CLP. So we are looking at how to make some of the tests on endocrine disruptor mandatory in the registration process. And for that, we will need to amend several REACH annexes. This process, I must say, of amending the REACH information requirements had already started even before the strategy, when the strategy on endocrine disruptors was adopted in the Commission a couple of years ago, in 2018. So most precisely, on the update of the annexes, REACH annexes 7 to 10 define the tests that should be performed at each tonnage band. In REACH, the registration is triggered by the tonnage, and the amount of information is triggered by tonnage of the production or the import of the substance in the European market. Annex 1 details how the registrants need to take into account the information that they have in the assessment of their chemical and reflect it. This is called a chemical safety assessment that needs to be reported or documented in a chemical safety report that has to accompany the registration dossier. So to build the new information requirements, both in Annex 1 and in Annexes 7 to 10, we use two important documents. One of them is the OECD Conceptual Framework for Testing and Assessment of Endocrine Disrupting Substances. This document lists all test methods agreed at international level for assessing endocrine disruption properties, including in vitro and in vivo tests. And the second one is, in fact, an amendment of the EU regulation on biocides, in which a mandatory endocrine disrupting test already exists to assess biocidal active substances. So even if the biocides regulation does not work in the same way as REACH regarding information requirements, as I will explain now, it is still important to note and to take into account to ensure coherence of the requirements under different pieces of legislation. So in the REACH registration procedure, as I mentioned before, the registration is tiered, and is tiered according to the volumes in which the substances are manufactured or imported. This is different from the biocides regulation, in which we ask, in fact, for a full data set for test on biocides active substance, regardless of the tonnage. For the inclusion of the new mandatory test on endocrine disrupting properties in REACH, we need to reflect on which test we need to perform and at which tonnage band. In particular, for the low tonnage bands, such as substances produced below 10 tons, so in between the 1 to 10 tons tonnage per year. We also have to balance two different objectives. The need to have sufficient and robust data to assess the properties of substances. As I said before, the objective of registration is to have sufficient information in order to assess the chemicals and also to classify. But at the same time, we aim at reducing the testing on vertebrate animals. So therefore, we need to consider a number of questions. How do we use in vitro tests in the best way? How to trigger additional testing, for example, based on the results on which the in vitro test, we can ask registrants to perform an in vivo test. How can we waive some tests? If we have, for example, clear results from in vivo tests, maybe this gives us enough information and we don't need to perform further tests. So these are the questions that we are considering in our work on the update of the information requirements. Currently, we only propose to include mandatory tests on estrogen, androgen, thyroid hormone, and steroidogenesis. It's easier in its modalities, and on vertebrates, due to the current knowledge and the available test methods. This is the same as it's happening in the biocides regulation. But we will, of course, include in vitro and in vivo tests to evaluate both effects on health and on the environment. We have developed two different options for the update of the REACH annexes for endocrine disruptors, and we are currently discussing them with the relevant experts in a subgroup of the competent authorities for REACH and CLP of Caracal. We've had, we launched also a study. You can see there in the slide where we have been discussing with the experts. We have already launched a study to gather information for an impact assessment for potential options. And the two options that I have mentioned were included. We also launched a targeted stakeholder consultation that runs until the 8th of October. And you can find the link here in my presentation in case you want to participate, and I heartily welcome your contribution in this consultation. And we also aim to adopt our formal proposal in 2022 as communicated in the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability at the end of 2022. So in conclusion, we have a really heavy agenda in front of us. We have the revision of two major pieces of horizontal legislation in the EU, which are REACH and CLP, and together with that, a number of other initiatives, such as the One Substance, One Assessment process, and other initiatives at international level. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. The revision of these proposals will come next year, and I hope that we will be able to have more in-depth discussions on the basis of actual Commission proposals in the next forum and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you need a large glass of water after that. That was like an extraordinary amount to get through. But as I've said to everybody throughout, that the slides may be available for them. But thank you you gave a heads up, the bigger picture, and then some more detail. And that was very interesting for me to hear about this introduction of hazard classes in the CLP regulation, but also the categorization system, you say, to better reflect the science and enable a more nuanced response to risk management. And also, I think what was useful to hear, because of the last two sessions we had yesterday, was you said that we need to aim at reducing testing on vertebrate animals, and that had very much come out yesterday in those last two sessions. Just one sort of, I don't know if it's a softer question, and then I have a couple that's more related to the strategy, and then we'll see what's come in. You can see we've had some questions from the audience. You said there it had become clear in the fitness check that the REACH evaluation was ineffective with regards to mandatory information requirements, and that you'd gone to ask companies, who had registered substances for new tests. It's just interesting for me to know, because your colleague spoke yesterday at the beginning, Mr. Sadauskas, about how everybody has a role to play. When you go back to companies and say, right, this is what we found in the fitness check, this is what we need, how are all those relationships between stakeholders? How do you see it? Because it's such a complex arena, is it not? I'm putting you on the spot there, I know. So I know that not over, but how is it? There's a lot of conversation that has to go on, isn't it? I mean, it's tremendously complex, is it not?
Yes, if you're talking about information requirements, of course, there's been a very long conversation about compliance with information requirements, and we have seen some studies and some results of studies that were highlighting that, in fact, 2/3 of the registration dossiers were not compliant with REACH, etc. I think, in all fairness, I think that companies have made an enormous effort to come to terms with REACH, understand it, and submit their registration dossiers. I think it's a process that we are working together. And for me, they are important learnings. I think the strategy is very clear on the zero tolerance to non-compliance. Right. So there we do want to strengthen this approach, as you say, from all parties. No, they need to commit to the legislation and comply with it. But also that some of the information that we have today, because as I said, REACH is almost the version of REACH today is like a first step into getting to know all the substances that we have on the market. So we need now to move on. We need to go to a second step. And we say very clearly that now the main purpose is that we are capable, not only us as authorities, but also the companies are capable of risk assessing the substances. Right. They need to make this chemical safety assessment. They need to report. They need to identify and recommend the necessary risk management measures. So when they are handling the substance, and also those that they are supplying the substance to, they do handle it safely. Right. And also we need to be able to identify. And this is one of the key learnings that we've had with the operation of REACH so far. we need to be able to have enough information to identify the substances. It's a bit useless to say that we're going to have a new hazard class on endocrine disruptors, well, 2 hazard classes, one for the human health, one for the environment. If at the end of the day, we don't have enough information to be able to classify the substance and identify them as such. So this for us is fundamental. And I think, as I said, from what has happened, let's move on, let's learn, and let's start setting the basis for this new stage, in which we are going to all combine the efforts to be able to have the more preventive approach that is called upon in the strategy, and definitely the authorities are committed to.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just hone in on a couple of points in your presentation, and then I can see we do have questions coming in. So the strategy also mentioned, and I know this because I had the privilege of moderating at Green Week recently on this particular topic, and of course it is the development of a safe and sustainable by design approach. Just can you explain a little bit more behind that concept for those who may not know so much?
Yes, I think this is also one of the learnings that we're having on the basis of the implementation of our current legislation. We realize that we need to move on from the current system that we have, which is very exposed. It's once the substances are there, when we go, we regulate them, we ban them, we look what are the properties, we identify, we ban. To have a more ex-ante, a more preventive approach. We need to know better from the beginning which substances we are even inventing, we are designing. It's about innovation. It's about doing substances in a way that they perform the function, the necessary function, for whatever product is being developed, but that they also do not harm. They are designed like that, not to harm human health and environment. So if we go in the strategy and we're calling for strengthening the regulation, to introduce this generic approach bans, to be stronger on those substances that cause harm, we also need to come hand in hand with an opportunity to develop them from the beginning differently. And I think that the two have to come together, and it's like closing the loop. You already start designing them, so in the future you don't end up in the situations that we have today. So today we have seen there were at some points some product developments. Someone at some point in some companies decided it would be a fantastic idea to introduce microplastic in certain products or to use PFAS, for example. And this have led us to situations we have environmental health crisis, and now we need to remediate. Solution, we are banning them. We are introducing bans in our legislation. However, the idea would be that product development didn't take place, that we already from the beginning realized this is if we put this type of substance, there will be PFAS, in consumer products, this wide dispersive use is going to pollute everything. You see what is happening here in Belgium with the pollution in Zwijndrecht. Who is going to remediate this? And this is a big problem. So we need to avoid this from the beginning. So while we are having a stronger hand in terms of not allowing the use of these substances, we need to find a way to innovate and to innovate into a brighter future, for chemicals that can still be used, but they do not harm.
And it does require, I know this is perhaps an overused word, but it does require, perhaps not a huge, because I think this is the way the conversation is in general, societally speaking, at all levels, but it does require some kind of paradigm shift, doesn't it? You've got to be thinking really specifically. There is strategy for companies. There is going to probably the costs at the outset. You've got to think differently alongside and to orchestrate that innovation. Do you not?
Absolutely, but I think it's also a great opportunity for companies. It's to innovate in certain direction, and in particular for European companies, they will give them the opportunity to be the spearhead in having chemicals that are safe and sustainable by design compared to the rest of the world. So at the same time, it's a great opportunity, and I think industry has realized, and they're really engaged in the development of this concept of safe and sustainable by design. I'm really looking forward to contribute to it.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, and then I will turn to audience questions. You said, I think, and it may have come up again at the end, but certainly near the beginning of your presentation of the strategy, you talked about the concept of essential use in the regulatory processes a little bit more slowly for the benefit of our interpreters. I know they're used to it. Can you just explain how you will implement it?
Well, currently we are developing the criteria. So what we say in the strategies that we base ourselves in what we already have in the Montreal Protocol. So basically that the use of the substance has to be essential for health, safety, critical for the functioning of society, and that there are no alternatives. And this is a very important point. So there are no other ways of going about it. We are developing now the criteria. In the Commission, we have a support study that we've launched to help us, because it's important to note that this essential use concept is very important in the application of our generic risk management approach. Although it can be used also in a specific risk management. So when you look specifically at the substance, how they behave, the exposures, etc. But it has to be applied across legislations. This is not only about REACH. It's about also the other piece of legislation, and this is the call in the strategy. So we have launched a study. There will be obviously public consultations, and we hope that we will be able to come up. We will need to have some results for the REACH review. So the revision of REACH, sorry, which is at the end of 2022. So we will get some results by mid next year, because we already need to finalize our impact assessment towards the summer for REACH. And then we'll see also how it can also be brought up in other legislation and embraced there.
And as you say, there's a lot going on in tandem. There's a lot of work. It seems like it's going to be dovetailing towards the latter part of next year. So a lot to be getting on with. Let us see. And you can also see now, everybody is going to see in the audience our eye lines drop a little bit because we're looking at a screen that's at floor level. There we go. Why could an endocrine disruptor hazard not be covered by reprotoxic classification? That's one question. Give you a moment to have a look. I don't know if you want to just take a look at the others because they're very different. So I'll just read those out also for the audience. What groups, workers or consumers, would actually fall into a vulnerable group category when it comes to the use of SVHCs? Pregnant women is the main one that comes to mind. So who would fall into that vulnerable group category? And a third one, are there already specific criteria for categorization of chemicals in categories 1 or 2? So it's up to you which one you want to treat first.
We can start with the first one.
Start with the first one.
I think
okay,
the first one is rather a question for the scientists that were here yesterday. Well, how is it possible that we haven't been able to identify so far today through the reprotoxic hazard class all endocrine disruptors? And the case is that it has not been used. So we know that for some endocrine disruptors, so we have substances today. We can today still, without the new hazard classes, we have today still managed to identify endocrine disruptors. We have criteria, as I mentioned, in the plant protection products and the biocides legislation. So some endocrine disruptors have been identified there. And we also through REACH, through the source of very high concern. And we have seen sometimes the application. So sometimes a chemical is reprotoxicant at the same time as its endocrine disruptor. But the fact is that we have been unable to identify all endocrine disruptors through the reprotoxicants. Why? I think it's rather a question for the scientists than for the policymaker. As here, where we are is to respond rather to what the scientists are telling us, is that it requires a different category because of the mode of action. So it's not
because of the
mode of action.
Okay.
So that's why we are operating on the basis of creating the new hazard classes, because we have been unable to use the reprotoxic classification.
So what about these vulnerable groups? What would
I think it's a very fair question. So far, everybody, when we talk about vulnerable groups, we can already see in some existing legislation that we prioritize certain groups, for example, children. Yeah. We have special legislation to protect them, in particular from the articles that are meant to be addressed to them, like toys. So we have quite protective legislation for toys. We don't have for tackle articles, and that's a blind spot that the strategy picks up. So we can think about children. Pregnant women is considered a vulnerable population, for example, when you're looking at occupational health and safety legislation. Yeah. Yeah. But to my knowledge, we don't have a list of these are the vulnerable populations. As in Europe, the population is getting older. Some are starting also to come and say elderly population is also a vulnerable population. So we will need to really look into the need to have maybe a more clear palette, of what are the vulnerable groups that we will be considering. And they may differ. Obviously, when you're talking about toys, you're focusing on children.
Yeah. And also yesterday, what did come up, which struck me, is that we, let's talk as consumers, citizens, however we want to call ourselves, are not actually aware of the exposure. We can do more for ourselves in terms of exposure. So absolutely, what would you constitute more vulnerable? In effect, we're all vulnerable, are we not? And we certainly saw that yesterday from session 2 on life stages, from when you're in the womb onwards. So, I mean, it is, as you say, it's a very, very interesting area. It requires a lot of thought, a lot of nuance.
At the same time, you were talking about the womb. Sometimes it's clear for us that kids or pregnant women would be vulnerable populations, but sometimes you don't even know.
Yeah.
In particular, in the early stages of pregnancy, you don't know that you're pregnant. So sometimes there is also the difficulty, with the definition that sometimes it's difficult to even know whether you should have, as a pregnant woman, for example, particular consideration to some exposures, as you don't even know that you are pregnant. So it's also an interesting consideration whether there is always the absolute knowledge that those individuals belong to this vulnerable population.
Okay, let's move on, because what have we got? Just over 15 minutes. So here we came to, the specific criteria. Are there specific criteria for categorization of chemicals, category 1 or 2? And then also we've got, will the SVHC attribution be only for ED category 1, or will it also be for category 2?
Okay. So the first question on the criteria, I guess they refer to endocrine disruptors. I mean, we do already have categorization system, as I said before, in CLP for other hazard classes, such as, for example, CMRs. STOT also, we have even three categories. So there is already well-established practice on categorization. And it's all about the evidence and the scientific evidence and how comfortable you feel to conclude that this is a known endocrine disruptor or a known CMR, or that this is presumed. So it's very much related to the evidence that you have. So we do have the experience about the categories on endocrine disruptor. The question is about that, because it's a bit ambiguous for me. I've already explained that we have some proposals and that we are still discussing internally and with experts from member states and stakeholders, and in the realm of the competent authorities for REACH and CLP. But we haven't adopted the proposal, of course. Yep. But there are already some ideas of how to go about it. And I think they're very much inspired with all the experience that we have in CLP for categorization. Mm-hmm.
We're also looking at, as I said, this issue of testing. And that was something that came up. That's something that you talked about in your presentation. So just for the benefit of the audience that can't see that question, will the expected effects analysed include a quantification of the number of animals to be used for testing purposes for each option? And will the impact assessment cover the impact on animals used in testing for the different options?
I think for the impact assessment, also for the original impact assessment of REACH, we always look at the animals that will be required according to the different tests that we will be proposing. So that element will be part of the impact assessment. We do have ideas of the animals used in Europe, maybe not exclusively through REACH, so maybe not exclusively on the regulatory framework on chemicals, but generally through the obligation to report the use of animals under the Directive for the Protection of Animals Used for Scientific Purposes. So we do have reports coming from member states in which we have an idea of how many animals have been used, what type of animals. Okay, and so we do have data of the amount of animals that are being used. In the case of the information that comes through the Directive of the Protection of Animals Used for Scientific Purposes, as I said, it's not only the animals used for the regulatory purposes and the REACH, so for registration and the REACH, it's much more. Yep. It's all type of research. So, but we do have that data. At the same time, ECA also reports every 5 years. They need to report on the operation of REACH and also on the use of animals. So data should be made available through the ECA report on that aspect. Most, not all, but most of the tests that are performed under REACH that require animal testing have to undergo a testing proposal. So they need to be approved, so to say. The registrant doesn't perform the test directly and then sends information as part of the registration dossier, but rather as part of the registration dossier, they make a proposal for testing. They say, I need to test this endpoint. This is the test that I'm proposing. The experts in ECHA will have a look at it in the evaluation of the testing proposals process, and they will see whether this is the test is well designed, because that's another thing. I mean, you can get different results, whether you use one species, use another species, whether you did it like this, or you dose enough the animals, or you don't. So they look that the test is properly designed, and then they have an idea also of the animals that would eventually be used. So there is a certain level of knowledge of the animals that have been used. But I think the important question, and I think the important challenge for all of us, is how we will get there. How we're going to get eventually to a point in which we can be sure of the safety of chemicals. We can be reassured that it's not going to harm us, or it's going to harm the environment, including animals. Maybe not the rats in the laboratory, but all the animals, the wildlife. And not use laboratory animals. And I think this is an objective that in the European Union we are fully committed to it. We need to balance for the time being, because we are not there. We don't have all the battery of in silico, in vitro tests that would allow us to do completely without animal testing, in order to have that reassurance on the safety of the chemical. And we are investing a lot to try to get there. But it's a long path that we've been walking for a long time. This is not a new commitment. This commitment has been there in the last century. So we've already invested an enormous amount of money to try to develop new test methods. And sometimes even, it's not about a one-to-one. Sometimes it's a battery of different test methods that do not use animals and that are capable of giving even a better result that you will get today with an animal test. But we still need to walk this walk. And in the meantime, what do we do?
Okay. Let's move on to the next question. I don't know how, we've got quite a few more, but I think we've got a bit more time. We've got about 10 minutes. So let's have a look at this one. You can see that for yourself. Will industry agree? Will the Risk Assessment Committee agree ED identification on the basis of in vitro tests only? So we're just obviously continuing on this same theme for a moment.
Mm-hmm. But this is this relates to what I was saying before. We need to be reassured that we do have the test that would allow the classification. And this is a problem also today. And I'm not talking only about endocrine disrupting properties. I'm talking about other properties. The reliance on in vitro for classification. We are still not there. So we are still doing a lot of work even for other endpoints in terms of using in vitro. But it is true that in vitro is used a lot for screening. So sometimes it's like a first step. And industry, as it's indicated there in the question, may disagree and may want to go beyond to the last stage, to demonstrate, try it until the last stage to demonstrate that the substance doesn't need to be classified. So that's also a big issue. So once we all agree that that's where it's important to have the regulatory acceptance. So once we all agree that the test is sufficient to classify or to derive information on the safety, then we all need to accept it, and that's used for regulatory purposes. And then we will all need to abide by it. But we need to get there also in terms of classification. That's a path to walk.
Okay. Are we good? We're taking a breather. You are remarkable. This is like sort of brain box bingo. It's mastermind. I mean, you are just in the hot seat. We take a moment. I might just ask, I might look this way to see how many questions we have approximately, just so that we can pace ourselves here. About 5 questions, my lovely colleague just off screen is telling me. So here we go. You see there what the response is. So there is a real question: shouldn't policymakers consider the restriction of certain EDCs based on the available academic scientific research, because procedures can take too long and harmful chemicals are out there in the market?
This brings us, well, this is like another, not a can of worms, but like another box to open, which is the use of academic data and how can we ensure that academic data is used for regulatory assessments. Mm-hmm. And that is one issue that we want to tackle with the one substance, one assessment. We know that there is a wealth of information done by academics in the research, but at the same time, there are difficulties of using this information, let it be by authorities or also by industry. In terms of industry and their obligations, because of the producer responsibility, when they are obliged not to report all available information on the substance in registration, for example. So one of the problems that we have is that they may ignore the existence of academic data. It's like all this academic data available information. No? So this is something that we are tackling under the One Substance, One Assessment. How can we ensure that academic data is documented and reported, also published in a way that it could be useful to be considered available information, both for industry, but also, or stakeholders, but also for regulators. Without finding that path, it's difficult now to exclusively based on that. So you will still need to go through your regulatory process. Even then, even later, even when we already have found a way under One Substance, One Assessment to have a better integration of academic data in the process, we still need to go through the classification process. So if academic data is there and can be used because we found a way that all this could be properly reported and published, et cetera, we will still need to go through RAC. RAC will still need to look at the dossier and say, yes, indeed, this substance is an endocrine disruptor on the basis of their assessment.
Okay.
So that cannot be used as a shortcut.
Sure. Okay. So
we need a regulatory process that provides certainty, legal certainty to all actors. So the process will still be there. The question is, how can we make better use of academic data?
Yeah.
And we are looking at that under the One Substance, One Assessment.
Do you ever sleep? You're looking at
Yes.
many things. Do you ever sleep? Will you ever sleep?
I do sleep.
Okay.
I sleep very well. Since the adoption of the strategy, I sleep like a baby.
Do you? I love that. Somebody's got to tweet that. Okay. What are the plans for the already identified EDs under REACH and biocides and pesticides regulations? So just getting a bit more into REACH. What are the plans for those that are already identified?
Well, I think the pressing question would be to include them as classified substances. Yeah. So the next step is to make sure that they are in Annex 6 of CLP, where it is where we have the list of all the harmonized classifications.
Okay, let's have a look. We've got a few more questions. We're good for time. Here we go. You can see that overwhelming amounts of research has shown that effects from exposure to mixtures of EDCs, we did talk about that yesterday, add up, and this risk is currently underestimated. So have a think there. The Commission has a working document about these mixtures, pointing to address them. This we know, but what can you tell us a little bit more because of this concern?
Well, the issue of mixture toxicity and the fact that we are not properly addressing it in legislation has been recognized for a long time. And we've had several communications on mixtures, and the last effort is indeed this staff working document that accompanied the strategy, the chemical strategy for sustainability. And there is the recognition that we need to do better on mixtures. The first step that we are taking is the inclusion of the mixture assessment factor in the chemical safety assessment.
A mixture assessment factor, okay.
Under the chemical safety assessment in REACH. So this type of assessment factors are already used in order to make the assessments of chemicals. And normally they are used when there is some intrinsic uncertainty that you cannot breach in another way. So for example, when you test on animals, you apply an assessment factor for to read those results in humans, because you're not going to be testing on humans. Yeah. So this is what assessment factors do. They add a value in the assessment that allows you to breach this innate impossibility to assess. No? So as we cannot assess all possible combinations, because this is we would not sleep if we had to assess on, and possibly it's a plan that we will not be able even to achieve in the span of humankind. Then, knowing that it's not infinite but almost close to infinite, there is a scientific uncertainty that we cannot bridge. We are suggesting to use this assessment factor to bridge it. And the first step is to use it in REACH, because it's the horizontal legislation, so companies will need to apply it when doing the risk assessment of their chemicals, and they need to report it in the chemical safety report. We will see where this assessment factor takes us. If it shows that we are being too lenient in some risk management measures that we've applied, or we are too conservative, we think that we will see with the practice in REACH how far we can then go into this path, no? Of going with a basic way of approaching it without trying to go down the road that we've tried until now, which is to try to assess all possible combinations of chemicals.
Okay. Let's see what we've got left. So if we just bring up, here we go. So we've got a few more, couple more. Let's take, even if we go over just a couple of minutes, I think it's very important, because there are obviously questions that we would like to answer now as opposed to afterwards. So here we go. Which legislative options will the impact assessment consider for consumer products that are not regulated by sectoral legislation? So that could be childcare articles, feminine hygiene products, textiles and furniture.
Okay. Well, maybe there is a slight detour on what we will consider options. So in which we already have the generic approach. So we can already take measures, we can have restrictions based on the generic approach to risk management. And we can do that for consumer articles. Okay? We want to extend, as I explained, to professional uses. I don't think that we will be looking into particular product categories, as the right of initiative is there. It's open. We can do it for any. Okay. So there is no need now, unless we are already proposing the restriction itself, unless the revision of REACH comes with a proposal for a restriction hand in hand on furniture or on hygiene, feminine hygiene products, or on childcare articles. We don't need to impact assess that now, because we have the process already today. So we don't even need to revise REACH for that. The question rather is how and what would be the timelines for the implementation of the extension that we are calling on the strategy. So we need to include more hazard classes, and at the first step, the endocrine disruptors and the PBTs, and then later on the other hazard classes. So we will be focusing a lot on what will be the timelines and the way that we are going to include this for the future. At the same time, we're also looking at the relationship between restrictions and authorizations in REACH, and whether we can improve the synergies, no? Whether we want to modify something in these two processes in order to make them work better, no? And also building on the experience that we have under both processes, no? In authorizations and restrictions. So it's a bit a detour, the question. You see what I mean, no?
Yep. Here we go. Will a ban on endocrine disruptors in these products, so childcare and so on, be implemented in parallel with the ban on ED in toys and cosmetics? So can consumers be protected from endocrine disruptors in some products but not all products?
Well, ideally, if we implement the chemical strategy the way that the actions have been called upon, and with the timings that have been indicated in the annex to the strategy, we will not have a situation in which we will be protecting children from childcare articles, from endocrine disruptors in childcare articles, or CMRs for that matter, in childcare articles through REACH, but we will not be protecting them from endocrine disruptors. They are already protected for CMRs in toys, but from endocrine disruptors in toys. In principle, the deadlines are the same. It's 2022. So in principle, that is the coherence aspect of the strategy. So in principle, if we all work together, in accordance with those timelines, the situation should not be there. There may be differences in months or of the legislature. Of course, the Commission does as it can. I mean, we propose. Then it has to go through co-decision. So then it's the Parliament and the Council that decide, no? But in principle, it shouldn't be the case. Okay. If things don't go as planned, then it could be that there is a higher level of protection under one piece of legislation than another.
Okay, I'm going to give you the hour because it's important, I think, for you to be able to answer. Yeah, I feel like I should go and get you a gin and tonic from there. I feel I should go and get the interpreters 25 gin and tonics. Here we go. So will you have a placeholder to include other endocrine modes of action? So if, for example, the OECD Conceptual Framework and GD 150 are updated with new endocrine pathways?
Well, I don't know if in concreto we are proposing a revision, but what is clear is that we are always ready and we have the right of initiative to modify this. Mm-hmm. So we can always include this. So we don't even need a placeholder. So what you could be asking is, would you already foresee an obligation on yourself to review in next time? But the question is, can we already foresee now what is going to be the timeline for the other modes of action? No? Mm-hmm. And because we cannot include any commitment from ourselves mm-hmm. to review if we don't know. But in any case, this can be answered by the next speaker. I think they're also going to talk about
indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just seeing our eye lines go a bit over the place, that's because we're having to look down at the screen for the questions and we're just deciding whether the question 967,000 should go to you, Christina, or whether it should go to the next speaker. I think we can leave that to
Feels
the next
like a lottery.
What do you think?
Yeah,
I think we can leave it to the next speaker. We can ask our lovely colleague, your colleague behind the scenes, to keep that one for our next speaker, because she is going to talk particularly about this one assessment, one substance, one assessment. She is going to talk about the support to the Commission. So I think that's something that she can very, very much take in hand. So we are at the close. I think I'm going to ask us a bigger and literally just 1 minute so that we don't lose time. But I did say I'd pose this. We got a question yesterday, which I'm not going to be saying verbatim, but we got a question from ExxonMobil saying, yes, okay, here's this work. There are substances, but let us not forget that it was a question in the context of COVID-19, that all of that equipment, the plastics, the PPE, the other equipment, the plastics in the hand gel, all of that stuff also saves lives. So there was a comment about this balance. And I ask you that in the context of something you said at the start of your presentation. You said it's a vision towards a toxic-free environment by 2030, where chemicals are produced and used in a way that maximizes their contribution to society. It's what your colleague, again, at the Commission said yesterday, while minimizing harm to the planet and current and future generations. Mm-hmm. So what you said, what your colleague said, that question coming in saying, but let's also remember that, you know, there is a wider context. We need to look at also this. What would you say in answer? Because that question came in after we had a chance to answer it yesterday.
In all fairness, I would say that we have not forgotten, and it's fully recognized in the strategy. So we know that a lot of the uses are important for health. They've advanced a lot our capacity to provide a very high level of medical assistance in Europe, for example. But at the same time, we also recognize that many of the uses of chemicals have given us discomfort, and they are not really those that are going to save lives. But this dichotomy, the fact that you have chemicals that are absolutely necessary for safety, for health, for not only on COVID pandemic, but also for airplanes, for critical infrastructure. There is a lot of important uses of chemicals. Let's not forget there are other uses of chemicals that are not so important. And this differentiating and trying to leave the use of the most harmful chemicals for those essential applications, for those essential uses, for those that really make a difference, is what the strategy is calling upon. It's like, forget about those that are for convenience, that are for other uses that are not really going to be life-changing. Focus on the ones, we will still need to use them. So focus on the ones that will really make a difference, and forget and substitute the others. And this substitute in the others. And that's why the safe and sustainable by design comes together with the bans. That's where we have the essential use concept. And it all comes together in the strategy. So what I would say is, we haven't forgotten. We don't need to remember it. It's in the strategy, and it's recognized in page 1 of the strategy. So it's not about that. It's about the willingness to do differently on the other uses. Those that are not essential for society, those that are convenience. And can we do better
those that
there?
are
No?
harmful. Yeah. Thank you so very much. And guess what? I can't even release you like entirely because you have to come back at the end to join me again. But I promise you, you're not going to be here for more than an hour next time. So I would like to say to all of you who are watching at home, first of all, thank you very much for being so rapid with your typing and for asking all of those questions, because it makes for a better event. That is what Christina is here for. I will now release you to have 25 cups of tea, and I will ask you to come back at the end. So thank you very much. We have one more session, and in fact, I remind you at home or in your offices, one more session before you get to take a bit of a break. So please put your feet up. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you,
You've been a star.
Thank you.
Okay, so what's happening next? What do we have? We have our second session of the day. We did mention it because there is a perfect question for Eka. And we are going to hear about Eka's work on endocrine disruptors. So let's just have a look if we can put the slide up of our next speaker, who isn't here physically but joining us virtually. So perhaps we can have a look at her slide, if her name is there. Kirsi, is she there? Can we see? I'm not sure, I'm just looking at the screens, perhaps not. It might take a moment. So Kirsi Majohanen, now that is a name I will definitely ask her, there we go, to pronounce herself, because I don't think I've done particularly well with that one. There you are, at the European Chemicals Agency. It's absolutely delightful to have you with us. Welcome. Can we hear you? Let's just check.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
I can. Kirsi, could you please speak your surname, because I didn't do a good job.
It's Myöhänen.
Okay, I didn't do a good job. Thank you very, very much. Now, you are a scientific officer, you're a human health expert in the classification unit of the European Chemicals Agency. So mainly, if I'm correct, as a scientific dossier manager for classification and labelling proposals. And you're also co-chair in the ECHA-ED expert group. So you've got real expertise around, well, obviously endocrine disruptors and mixture classification and CLP labelling issues. And I hope today you're going to provide us an update on ECHA's activities and also what we just talked about there about this one substance, one assessment approach and the support that you give to the Commission. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. I will tackle those points.
All of those points and more. Okay, so again, the audience can ask you questions. I think they very well know how, so I will hand over the floor to you, Kirsi, and I'll pop back at the end and see what's coming. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, and many thanks also for Commission for inviting ECHA to give this update on our activities on ED. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kirsi Myöhänen, and as said, I work in classification unit, and I recently started as a co-chair of ED expert group, so I'm rather new in this area, but anyway, highly interested of this topic. So next slide, please. So there is a wide range of chemicals legislations managed by ECHA, and two of them directly address this endocrine disruptors, so they are REACH and Biocidal product regulation. And we have a lot of information available and gathered for these type of substances to assess the human health and environmental hazards and also risks. And these include the assessment of ED properties as well. And especially for high tonnage REACH substances and particularly for biocides, we have quite extensive information requirements for biocides due to the nature of the active substances, where they have aimed to kill or for example, prevent growth of some kind of organisms. So we need these needs to be fully investigated. And next, please. Yes, the REACH and the BPR. So next slide, please. So our presentation from ECHA is divided to three parts. First of all, some update on the REACH regulation related ED activities, and then on biocides, and finally some additional horizontal ED related activities. So let's start with the next slide on REACH issues, and we have here the really nice. It's actually on our website. It's an interactive page or kind of map of our integrated regulatory strategy. What happens for the REACH chemicals. So first of all, now lately we have done more like a grouping and focused on the grouping of structurally similar substances, for instance, to avoid unnecessarily testing and to have more efficient assessment for the substances. And then we try to screen and do this kind of early risk management option analysis so that we already know at early stage as possible which type of risk management options would be best for the substance. And then in the substance evaluation and dossier evaluation processes, there is a possibility to request further information, especially on EDs and ED properties and for the substances. And then finally, when all the information is gathered, then the correct risk management options are selected, and they can be either for EDs, it can be a restriction or it can be a substance of very high concern, which is then on the candidate list, and then later it might also end up to the authorization list and request authorization. And then harmonized classification and labeling is one of the options which will in the future, of course, come to the EDs as well. The next, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is just a link to the, if you would like to have some more details on this strategy. And the next one, please. So some more details on the regulatory risk management of EDs. So due to ED properties, there are altogether 19 substances or groups of substances which are identified as substances of very high concern out of more than 200 and included on the candidate list. And two of these were recently added, PDDP and bisphenol B, were added on candidate list this year. And currently there are 4 consultations for SPHC ongoing, and one of the substances is due to the ED properties, EDs for human health. And 2 EDs are already included in Annex 14, subject to authorization, and 3 on Annex 17 for restrictions. But of course, more EDs are to come, especially for the SPHC proposals. The next, please. So there are possibilities to request further data, especially in the substance evaluation process on the ED properties. And now we have currently more than 100 substances in the so-called CORAP list in the Community Rolling Action Plan for the substance evaluation due to the ED concern. And then member states are evaluating these substances, and already 41 substance evaluation decisions have been addressed due to ED concerns. And there are more data requested, so new data for 23 substances which have been currently generated and evaluated. And we encourage the member states to consult the ED expert group of ECHA before and also after requesting the new data, so that the highly qualified ED experts in the ED expert group can give some advice which would be the best new tests needed, or if there is a need to have some additional data on the ED properties. The next, please. So the ED expert group was established in ECHA 8 years ago. It gives informal and also non-binding scientific advice on assessment of ED properties of chemicals, both REACH chemicals and biocidal active substances. And we have 52 external members in the ED expert group, so 19 member states or EEA-CAs. Then we have 4 DGs from European Commission, several stakeholder organizations, including industry and public interest organization, and also EFSA, OECD, and Switzerland. The next, please. The ED expert group ECHA has hosted already 19 meetings for the ED expert group. This has been considered as very useful and well-functioning group. They have provided scientific advice on more than 100 substances, and most of the substances so far have been REACH substances, but the amount of biocides is increasing. It's now something between 20 and 25%, and it's increasing all the time. And out of these substances where the group provided some advice, when we look at them, the outcome of the substance evaluation or SVHC or BPC opinion has been for 12 of those considered as an ED, and 4 which were considered no concern for the ED. But most of the substances, there is still further information under generation, or the assessment needs to be refined. So, but all in all, the advice from the ED expert group goes quite well hand in hand with the outcome of the opinions and decisions in the forums. Next, please. So now let's move on the biocides side, the next one. So as you know, since 2018, the criteria in BPR and also for PPP has been in place, and we have developed together with EFSA and JRC the guidance how to assess the ED properties based on these scientific criteria in the regulations. The next one. And here in the ED expert group, we have had 25 biocidal active substances under discussion so far, and 2 of them were concluded as EDs by the BPC committee, and rest of them are still under assessment. And overall, in the Biocidal Products Committee, there have been 22 active substances discussed after the criteria for EDs were put in place. So for all of them, an ED assessment needs to be done, and 2 of them were identified as EDs and 6 not EDs for human health, whereas 4 not for the environment. But for majority of substances, the conclusion was not possible, and this is the outcome that can be applied only for that conclusion is not possible, is only applicable for those biocidal active substances which were submitted during the old Biocides directive before 2013, and for the newer ones there always must be a conclusion whether it's an ED or not. Next one, please. So then we have some other biocides related activities on EDs ongoing, and one of the hot topics is the ED assessment of non-active substances in the biocidal products. So when we have a product, we don't actually have a guidance for that, but ED assessment needs to be done also for the co-formulants, and of course most of the co-formulants are REACH chemicals as well, so there is a link established with the REACH assessment, and we also in ECHA provide support for this work, and further guidance is needed on this. The next one, please. And then there are a few special requests from Commission to the Biocidal Product Committee on EDs. So one is according to Article 75(1)(g) of the BPR, where Commission asked the ECHA BPC opinion on the evaluation of further evaluation on cyanamide and DPNPA, especially to clarify whether the safe level or a threshold can be found for these ED properties of these substances, and the BPC opinion is expected to be adapted by the end of this year. And then there is another request which is under Article 15.2 of the BPR to early review of some already approved active substances. So these are, one is antifouling substance, CNEP, and then 2 disinfectant iodine products, where as a result of JRC screening, they found significant indications for ED properties, so there needs to be an early review for these substances. And then the next, please, is my last slide on biocides. about ED impurities in biocidal active substances. So there is a note agreed by the member states in the CA meeting for biocides that when you have impurity identified as an ED, this triggers also the identification of the active substance as an ED, and there is no threshold for the impurities which are EDs. So additional information can be requested also on impurities. However, it's not so bad as it looks like. Normally, of course, the substance, the biocidal active substance, is tested, including its impurities. So then when this substance, which is tested with impurity, does not meet the criteria for ED, then it's not considered as an ED and further assessment is not needed. And this document is publicly available if you would like to see some further details on this. The next, please, is my last part of the presentation, additional ED activities. So next one. So this is related to the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, CSS. So ECHA has given support for Commission and Member State in developing the information requirements for endocrine disruptors under REACH and also under Biocides regulation. And then we are currently, this is ongoing, we are giving support in developing classification criteria for ED properties under CLP. Of course, we also collaborate very closely with EFSA expert groups and committees, like a working group on EDs from EFSA. And then we also contribute to the research activities, especially those founded or by Commission or related to Commission projects. And the next, please. So here we have not only REACH and BPR, but we also the CLP regulation, which is one of the key regulations, which has very important role in the hazard identification of ED properties. This supports the one substance, one hazard assessment principle. So we can improve this by bringing hazard assessment part to the of EDs to the CLP regulation. Of course, the risk assessment is always depending on the regulation and it may vary, and therefore the final outcome may be different depending on each regulation. But the hazard assessment should be the same and follow the one substance, one assessment approach. So here we have the CLP, which is considered as a key regulation for this. And the next one, and my final slide for today, is about this having classification criteria for EDs in the CLP. So this work is ongoing, as said, and ECHA supports Commission in drafting the criteria. It is very easy to refer to CLP in other horizontal regulations across the EU. And we have also this concept for harmonized classification in the CLP regulation. It's settled and very well functioning concept. ECHA has risk assessment committee, which has very strong expertise, highly qualified experts who classify already REACH chemicals and biocidal active substances and PPPs. So RAC is very well functioning and also working a lot with CMRs, with STOT, specific target organ toxicants, and also discussing on the mechanisms and mode of actions of these hazards. So these are regularly discussed and assessed by RAC. So it's easy for RAC also then in the future to assess the harmonized classification of EDs. Of course, it's much more complex than the current hazard classes. We have to take into account the endocrine activity, the biologically plausible link between the mode of action and adversity. But so it will be also highly complex to determine the criteria. So it will take some time before the new hazard class and criteria can be adopted at EU level. But we are working hard to get there and hopefully also in the future to have it globally in the GHS, as was also mentioned by Christina in her presentation. So this was a short update on the ECHA's activities on ED, so I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kirsi. And I have a question, which I've just, from listening to your presentation, and I see we have 5 or 6 that have come in from the audience. Let me just remind the audience that you are quite new in the ED expert group, so I think you've said if there are some things that you might not come directly back on, then they will certainly be in the summary report. So I might just take 3 or 4 minutes into the break just to allow you to answer those. I mean, the first thing you said there, that the CLP regulation is a cornerstone regulation in the EU. The EDs are planned to be included in the regulation. So just to clarify a bit further, ECHA's role in drafting the classification criteria for the EDs in the CLP, and just to give us an idea of how the work's progressing, because you did say it's complex.
Yeah, we are working together with Commission and the Member State. We have been involved in the Caracal subgroups on EDs. We have had a couple of rounds of discussions in these groups. We have also helped Commission in preparation of the documents for the discussion in this forum, and some detailed tables also, and something how this can be done in practice, but there are still some issues that need some further clarification, and probably also work from ECHA and support, such as how the category 2 will be assessed, how the criteria for ED category 2 will be drafted, and we are working with that then together with Commission and the Member State, and of course the stakeholders as well.
Okay. So I'm just going to have a look down at the screen that's just below me to see the question that came up. I don't know if you caught the end of Christina and my conversation here, but a question came in which actually we've saved for you. Is a guidance document for the implementation of the CLP-ED criteria foreseen, and will the EFSA-ECHA guidance document for ED identification for pesticides and biocides be revised accordingly?
Yes. Yes, of course, we need to harmonize the guidance documents. So normally there is already a CLP guidance on application of the CLP criteria, but of course it doesn't yet include EDs. But then that document needs to be revised and include EDs when there are criteria for EDs in CLP regulation, and how it will then be dealt with the existing guidance for ED assessment. This is to be seen, but of course we harmonize everything and look that it's reasonable and not redundant.
Let me move on to the next question. So can we get some clarity when we're looking at some timelines of evaluations? Can you give any clarity on those timelines, and when will each chemical substance evaluation be concluded?
You mean for the EDs? Well, there is the CORAP list for the substance evaluation, and it's also the member states have certain timelines how they should, like when they should request further data and so on. So this is set and it's going rolling all the time at the moment. So of course there are a lot of substances and everything cannot be handled at once, but yeah.
Okay. So you can't give any. Okay, so you can't say exactly when everything will be concluded, because there is a lot to be evaluated. Is that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and just on this whole process, this substance evaluation process, and the length of time it takes until it's, a substance is finally evaluated and then regulated. Do you see any possibility to accelerate that process?
Sorry, can you repeat which process?
The evaluation process, the substance evaluation process, it takes a long time, and then, it's finally regulated. Do you see any possibility to accelerate that process?
Yeah, I'm not perhaps the correct person to answer because I haven't been working with substance evaluation, but of course I can pass this question to my colleagues and then have a look if it can be somehow.
Certainly, that can certainly, as I said, there is a summary report, so that one, since we are curating all the questions, can be answered accordingly. Okay, thank you very much. Let's look at the expert group of which you are a part. After the introduction of CLP hazard classes for EDs, what will be the role of that group, and do you think what will be the link with the biocides regulation? Is the group going to work together? Is it going to assist the RAC there?
Yes, of course, this is possible, but maybe it's too early to say also anything for that. But we are exploring then this possibility and how it can be done in practice.
Okay, so nothing firmed up, but you're looking at it to see what would be the best way to.
Yeah.
Okay. And a bit of a different question. Could we have the list of the biocidal substances for the edlist.org website?
At least the biocides assessment, the BBC opinions are available on our website, and all the BBC opinions include also the part for the ED, how it was concluded.
Okay, and a last question for you, if I may, before we take a break and I release you and the audience to just have a bit of fresh air. Besides biocide active substances, how do you evaluate the ED potential of co-formulants in biocide products? Do you have any kind of proper data from applicants to evaluate them?
Yeah, this is the hot topic, as I told, and there is still no guidance for that, how to do it. But the work is ongoing, and of course the REACH data will be used as much as possible for this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kirsi. You do have a tough job coming just before the break when everybody knows that they're just going to be able to step away for a moment, but thank you very much. Indeed, do chat with your colleagues if you can give us a little bit more information on that question that came in there. That would be wonderful. You get to take a break. Do follow the event backstage if your schedule allows, and I say the same to our audience. It is now, 4:03. It's 1600 CST. We're going to take a break until 4:30. So don't forget to tweet if you fancy. The most important thing is please do not come back. We've got more than 200 people and climbing. So thank you very much. And we still have 2 45-minute sessions, pieces of the puzzle that you do need to hear at this year's 3rd annual forum. And of course, the first one, which details work in progress on endocrine disruptors and the cosmetics regulation, features 2 fabulous ladies who join me at a distance on stage. Don't be late, 4:30. See you then. Thank you very much to all our speakers of this morning. Did everybody just see me? Everybody who's watching, did you just see me scribbling, doing my very important, intelligent stuff before I welcomed you back after the break? You probably did. It's good to see stuff behind the scenes, I think. So, officially, welcome back to the second day of the third annual Forum on Endocrine Disruptors, or welcome perhaps for the first time if you're just popping in for these last couple of sessions. Just a reminder, tweet at any time, hashtag Endocrine Disruptors, ask questions through the chat channel of the platform in English only, super, super short. Do say to whom they're addressed, because our next session does feature 2 speakers, so that's very, very important. You can get slides after this event, and there will be a summary report of the brilliance that comes from all of our speakers' brains. So voila, don't worry if you haven't scribbled everything. Let's get stuck in now, and this first session of 45 minutes is all about the work in progress on endocrine disruptors and the cosmetics regulation. Now, who do we have? We should have a slide with both of the speakers, even though they will present one by one, and they are both with me at the Charlemagne building in Brussels. Let's give just a moment to see if we have their names. It's always takes a while technically. There we go. We have the first, but it is correct. That is our first speaker. She is called Petra Leroy-Cardova, and she is Policy Officer, Bioeconomy, Chemicals and Cosmetics Unit, and she is at DG Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. So I'm going to give a very warm welcome because it's brilliant. I have another female joining me on stage. So I'm going to shift now to my left and let her come in. You've been reticent. You've been standing. Hang on. There we are. You've been standing so far in the wings. There you go. So. No, yes, there are so many cameras. It's insane, isn't it? But show them your best side straight forward. I'm going to let you present, and then your colleague is going to present. And what we're going to do is gather audience questions and then put them to both of you after we've heard both your presentations. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Thank you, Environment, for inviting me here today. Apologies, I'm trying to figure out the camera, but I think I got the right one, even though I was told 10 times it was that one. So again, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my 3rd annual forum, actually, and I'm very excited because I'm not behind my computer, and I have to say it's a little bit of an awkward feeling, but it's nice to see people. So Katrina already presented me. Maybe the difference from last year when I spoke here in December is that we have a newly created unit in DG Grow that now is dealing with bioeconomy, chemicals, and cosmetics. But I am here to represent the cosmetics sector. Today I will give a regulatory update on what has been achieved since last December, followed by Vera from the SCCS, who will give a more scientific touch to the discussions. Okay. So for the first slide, what is new since last year, since last December when I was speaking here on the same occasion? Well, this year the spotlight is on the chemical strategy. We all know that. However, I would still like to give an update on what we are doing specifically in cosmetic products and regulating potential EDs. So just as a short reminder, I'm on the wrong slide, apologies for that. One more, voila. So just to remind that the Commission established a priority list of substances with potential ED properties in early 2019. This list that we consolidated consisted of 28 substances that was divided into 2 groups, so Group A and Group B, and both groups had 14 substances. Why did we do this? Well, Group A consisted of substances that needed to be treated with higher priority, that needed to be risk assessed a bit faster. I will go into more detail on the next slide, but also just to mention that for each group, we had to launch calls for data to gather scientific evidence. And that's not me, that's maybe Voila, battery issue. No, here we go. So on this slide, you will see all the Group A substances for which risk assessment has already been completed. So you will see resorcinol, propylparaben, benzophenone 3, octocrylene, and homosalate. The objective today is not to go into detail into the scientific opinions, but you will see that this concerns 3 UV filters, a preservative, and a hair dye. And in some cases, the final SCCS risk assessment was positive, so the substance is safe. In other cases, in 3 cases out of 5 actually, the conclusion was that the substance is not safe and it has to be either banned or restricted. In this case, all 3 concerned restrictions, so lowering concentrations. Now, the story with Group A is not finished. The SCCS is still, there are 7 ongoing risk assessments for the 7 substances you see here. I will not read them out, but you can see them on the left side of the slide. So SCCS is working on the risk assessment. Hopefully, well, Vera will be able to provide more information as to when the preliminary opinions could be expected. And then on the right side, you see that there's still benzyl salicylate and benzophenone. So for benzyl salicylate, we are waiting for a safety dossier to be submitted. And for benzophenone, well, it's under the CLP regulation, it's been included in the intention for a harmonized classification and labeling. So it could potentially be a CMAR 2 once that process is terminated. Now, moving on to the Group B substances. So there were also 14 of them. We launched a call for data this year in early February, I believe, and it's running until the 15th of November, so a couple more months for this call for data, except for butylparaben. This is a substance that was actually classified as a substance of very high concern under the SCV process, under REACH, because of ED properties for human health. So for butylparaben, we gave a shorter deadline for the call for data, and that ended in July 2021. So we are consolidating the input that came in, and we are preparing a mandate to the SCCS for another risk assessment that should start very soon, despite all the other risk assessments they have going on. So I think the most hot topic today is probably the chemical strategy. So as you may have heard or from the Have Your Say website, is that to deliver on the commitments of the chemical strategy, the cosmetic regulation will also have to be subject to a targeted revision. We will be preparing an impact assessment as well and running a support study. We are expected to have a legislative proposal by the end of next year. Yes, very ambitious. And then maybe particularly as the conference today is on endocrines, so there are 2 aspects that will be considered in the revision, which Christina already explained earlier on. So the first is to extend the GRA approach to EDs in cosmetics, which we have for CMRs already, but we will have to assess that option. That could be an option that we just extend the current provisions to include EDs. However, there is slightly something different, and again, it was touched upon, is this concept of essential use. So endocrine disruptors must be banned in all consumer products, so just not cosmetics, as soon as they are identified, allowing use only if essential. So this is something very different that needs to be considered this year or in our revision. We're trying to work as fast as possible and also to assure our stakeholders that we are following very closely what is going on in the REACH revision, the CLP revision. There are numerous studies going on, and we need to ensure that we are not duplicating the work and that we're not missing anything. So we really ask for your participation in the different stakeholder consultation opportunities that are forthcoming. Maybe the first thing to look out for is the publication of the Inception Impact Assessment. It's a 4-week stakeholder feedback opportunity. It has not been published yet, but we do hope to get it out in October. So please look at the websites. It's the Have Your Say website, and be involved. It's very important that we have all the necessary feedback to make this revision the best it can be. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of the regulatory update. We also invited SCCS to focus more a little bit on the science. So for those interested in cosmetics and science, I give the floor back to Katrina, and then she will introduce Vera. And we will be back for a Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And can I just say, I love that. You said for the interested in cosmetics and science, I give the floor back. I thought, oh, geez, she's going to get me to do Vera's presentation. No, I can actually talk about cosmetics till the cows come home, but I'm not going to do the science bit with it, as Jennifer Aniston would say. Just one quick question, if I could, for you, and then you're going to come back. I'm not going to take up, and I'm sort of, forgive me if camera angles wise, dear audience, we're not doing the best by you, but this whole conversation, this question that I'd put to Christina at the outset, you were here on sustainability by design, safe and sustainable by design. I mean, I'm just wondering, in terms of cosmetics, that everything, that sustainability is built in from the start of a product. And obviously cosmetics is very consumer facing. Does it feature? Is it something that you need to be thinking about as well?
Well, it is included. It is a sector that is included in the discussions, but our current regulation, it doesn't regulate this aspect per se.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. We are what you call a downstream regulation. So what's very important is what happens now at REACH level, at CLP level, and the implications it could have on us.
Yeah.
There are other regulations in the scope of the exercise, such as toys as well, and the sustainable by design. We are following those discussions as well. There are a plethora of initiatives.
That's a good word, plethora of initiatives, and that I think I captured also from Christina, who said, now I'm sleeping because the strategy's there. But you said legislative proposal, okay, ambitious, Q4 2022, but that seems to be where everything is heading at the moment, does it not? I mean, there's all of this work going on in parallel.
And we are keeping the stakeholders very busy.
Okay.
So I hope they're not too upset with us.
I think that's as it should be, really. I would say that as your average consumer/citizen. I think that's the right thing. Okay, so I'm going to release you. Thank you so very much. I'm going to just step here, and Petra is going to leave the stage because I'd like to introduce the co-chair of the SCCS to join me here, Vera Rogers. So I don't know if I'm going to give a moment to just have her name appear on screen. I know there's a little bit of technical fiddling that has to happen behind the scenes to juggle it all. There we go, the co-chair of the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety. Now I can ask her actually to join me. So you can actually, I love that. Do you know, Vera, that was priceless. You were so involved in reading those questions that had come in, and I was introducing you and you did not appear. But do you know what? You were doing your job. You were reading the questions. That was tremendous. Okay. Tell me, so how are you intending to complement your colleague's presentation? What are you going to share with us?
Well, I'm going to play the teacher and to try to talk to the people that do not know the difference between hazard and risk. And because if you do a discussion in this topic, you should first really understand what is the difference between hazard and risk. And I must say, when I heard Echa saying one substance and then between brackets one hazard assessment, that is the only thing which is correct. Because if you say one substance, one assessment, this is misleading. Because if we talk of hazard and risk assessment, that is a completely different story. Okay. And so I'm going to teach. I put on my hat as a teacher, and I will talk and hope that the people will understand what is the difference between hazard and risk. Okay. Because when I hear throughout all the speakers in the conference, I hear a lot of, it's all put in one big heap, hazard and risk, and it is completely different. And if you don't understand it, you're making mistakes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I love that. Then, yeah. Okay. So there's your camera. There's your audience. Okay. I will pop back. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I think I have to bring the first slide. Huh? Okay. So for those that do not know, first of all, good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure to be here again to speak about endocrine disruptors, but to speak on behalf of the Scientific Committee of Consumer Safety. And for those that do not know what is the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety, this is a group of independent scientists, and that is important, the word independence, because we are independent of the Commission, and we give scientific advice to the Commission, and especially we do risk assessment on mandates that we get from different DGs on substances, and we put our efforts. It's a lot about cosmetic ingredients, but there are also, for example, toys and other substances that are important in consumer products. But what I would like to focus on is on the difference between risk and hazard. So what the SCCS does is risk assessment, and that means that includes, of course, also hazard, but we go further. And so what we don't do, that is a classification according to hazard. That is a task, and you have heard that very well, that is a task which is done by other DGs. So what I want to say here is really as a teacher, that is, I'm going to show you what I show my students when I when I'm talking about basic toxicology. And that is the difference between hazard and risk. And these are two different items. Now, what do we mean? There's a lot of confusion. And when we are talking of endocrine disruptors, we always have to be very careful of what are we especially talking. Is that about hazard, or is it about risk for the persons? So what is hazard? Hazard is nothing else than an intrinsic property. It is a property of a substance that you're looking at. So it is the potential to cause injury, and it has no relation with dose or exposure. When we talk about risk, then that is quantitative, that is calculated, it is a probability that there will be adversity. And that is related to dose and to exposure, that is clear. And it goes a bit further, it is extended towards severity and the nature of harm. But that is all words, so perhaps it is more speaking to you when I show you a cartoon. And that cartoon is about, I think this is here, a lion. I think that everybody agrees with me that a lion is a dangerous animal. So dangerous animal, that means a high hazard. So when we are now seeing that lion is in a cage, and you're at the right side of the bar, so that means not with the lion, then that is still the same hazard, that is the same dangerous animal. But it doesn't mean anything for you. There is no risk for you. So it means that you have here the same animal with its property of being a high hazard, and you're safe. But if you put your arm to it and you say, what a nice pussycat, well, then your risk becomes higher. So it is depending on the situation that the hazard which is high can become a low of a high risk for you. So let me show you the next one. Now for cyanide, that is a well-known compound. Now, not that it is used in cosmetics, far from. But it is a compound that everybody knows, because we all remember the pictures that we have seen on television, where there was somebody drinking, in court case, a liquid with cyanide in, and he was even dead before he went to the hospital. So cyanide is something we have in the lab. Cyanide is used when we want to have the cells not produce energy anymore, no ATP. And we have it in the lab, but it is in a cupboard, it is well locked, and you are supposed that the collaborators know what that substance is. So it means that the cyanide is a high hazard substance. It's dangerous. But when it is locked in the cupboard and when somebody uses it that knows what it is gives no risk. But let us look to a situation that often happens in the lab, and that is we have in our lab quite a bit of young ladies. And sometimes they are pregnant, they have then giving birth, and they want to show their nice baby. So they come in the lab, and when you were just wanting to, like you have now the recipient with the potassium cyanide in your hands, and you want to go to weight what you needed for your cell cultures, well, then you say, oh, well, let us go to the room where we have the coffee room, tea, or whatever, and you take it with you. You shouldn't, but that is something, you do it, and you have it with you, and you put it there. But if there are other children with the lady, they can't read, they can't know. So for them, it becomes that high hazard, becomes a higher risk. And if somebody says, oh, I would like to have a bit sugar in my tea or in my coffee, and it is disturbed, there is a little spoon in it, it's white, and it doesn't smell bad at all. If you would put a spoon in your cup, well, then your risk is as high as a hazard, you will drop that. So that is to tell you that hazard and risk is very different, and that risk is depending of a certain scenario, of a certain situation, and a certain exposure. Now I go to water. And we all know that water is used a lot in cosmetics. It's an important ingredient. And I think everybody agrees that the hazard of water is zero. Water is not hazardous. But if you don't drink water at all, well, then you will die after a certain time. If you drink between 1 and 3 liters, then no risk, no hazard, everything is fine. If, however, you have a consumption of, let's say, 12 liters water a day, you would say, who is now crazy to drink 12 liters? Well, if you have anorexic patients, they exercise that to drink more and more in order not to have an hungry feeling. But if we look back, if you know from Ghent, that is my hometown, if you have there a castle and there is a torture room, always interesting to check and to look at when you're working in toxicology, well, then you will see there the picture that you see here, that it was a torture technique in the Middle Ages to bring in water more and more and more until all organs were bursting. And it was a very painful death with a disequilibrium of all what you could imagine of ions in your body, but here it is really bursting of the organs. So what I'm saying here is that this is a risk which is as high as you can imagine you are dying, but we were talking of a non-hazardous substance. So what is my lesson that I'm telling here is that, again, you can have a low hazard and a high risk, or a low hazard with a low risk. It all depends on the situation. So, and what does it now mean for when we are talking of endocrine disruptors? What is it to do with a potential endocrine disruptor? Well, the SCCS looks to what is a safe dose. So what we do is for a specific exposure, we look to the calculated probability of an adverse effect. So we follow the World Health Organization, so all the rules there for endocrine disruptor, and the stepwise framework of the OECD 150, the revised version. And what do we have? Well, we have the exposure level, so which gives us the biological relevance. We have, of the 5 levels that there are, 2 levels. And the level 1 is giving us, because SCCS, most of the time we look to substances which exist. So these are ingredients that are on the annexes of the cosmetic legislation 1223 2009, and which are colorants, preservatives, UV filters, air dyes, or whatever substance for which there is concern within the member states, and where we get the mandate to have a look at it. So here now for endocrine disruptors, what we see is you have seen that the list of 28 substances. These are substances that these are not new substances, these are existing ones. And for most of these, we have the point of departure. So that is the value that we need in order to calculate the margin of safety. Margin of safety being the point of departure divided by the systemic exposure dose, so to what you are internally exposed. And there, the World Health Organization says, well, that is really basic, it should be at least 100. Now, this is what we usually have, so these are historical no observable adverse effect level data. But if we don't have them, what have we then? So then we have in chemical, so which are the physical-chemical data that we have of the substance we are looking at. These are in silico data, and we see that more and more read across is gaining field. And so what does it mean? Well, there you are looking to a structure with the same structure, with the same function, and where you have toxicological data, and you try to do an extrapolation for your compound for which you do not have these data. But you have also QSER, where you then need a series of compounds. So databases become very important. And in our 11th revision of the Notes of Guidance, we have put just all these different databases that are free access, we have put them in appendixes, so in order to make it more user-friendly. And then you have the in vitro data. So in vitro data, you have all heard of the 2D cultures, the 3D cultures, but microorgans, organ on a chip, and we are talking today more and more of human-based cell systems so that you get human-relevant results and that you're not looking to cells coming from rats, from mouse, and so on, that we go for more and more for human-relevant data. We have the omics data, which will give us some molecular insight. And we have also all kinds of more modern technology, which more and more needs to be included into toxicological analysis. So the computational systems, biology, artificial intelligence, and there is a lot that you can mention. Also, if you want to do an extrapolation from in vitro to in vivo, PBPK modeling is more and more being developed. But, okay, it is not perfect, that we all know. We have also level 2, which has been mentioned, so the in vitro assays, which is then oestrogenicity, androgenicity, sterogenicity, and then the thyroid function. Now, more and more we see alternative methods, but okay, these is hazard methods, these are screening methods, but also for thyroid function is getting more importance. Now, and then I come to a very sensitive issue, and you all know that that is for the cosmetics legislation, and cosmetics are in Europe that we cannot use animals. And so this is supposed to be free of animals. Now, you know that when we look to what other data can be used, well, that certainly are in vitro assays coming from environmental health, but it is also the data that we have to, and I say have to use within the SCCS, because we are looking to human health, whereas ECHA is looking to environmental. So the cosmetics and the cosmetic legislation is about human health, and we are exempted for human health, but not for environmental. And that is done by ECHA. Now, you know the story that there are different compounds, and I've heard it also today, that there are different compounds which are only used in cosmetics, and for which there are data asked to be done in animals, and these data we have to use them in our dossiers. Whereas the industry may not use these data in order to prove the safety of their ingredients. So you feel that there is an enormous tension that is built up where there needs to be answers given. So I would give you two examples. You have first the example of resorcinol. Resorcinol has been mentioned already. It's an ingredient which is used as an air dye in a maximum concentration of 1.25%. And it is inhibiting the thyroid function. So yes, it is an endocrine disruptor. There is no doubt about that. That is a hazard, it is an endocrine disruptor. But when you look to when it occurs, it is at relatively high doses, which are not used in cosmetics. And when we do the calculations for the margin of safety, for that air dye, we get a value of 4,000, so which is much higher than the minimum 100 that you need. And so we say that this is a safe dose in the particular application of a hair dye of maximum 1.25%. And that is because we do risk assessment. If you would only say hazard, then you say no, out, but it doesn't make sense when you scientifically base yourself on the scientific basis of toxicology. When we look to benzophenone 3, there it is UV filter proposed at a concentration of 6%. Everybody, also ECHA, everybody has looked through the whole literature, and you cannot say, it is not conclusive, you cannot say it is an endocrine disruptor. So you have to say that the endocrine disruptor here is not a hazard, so you would say, okay, then it is fine. No, you do risk assessment, and for risk assessment we have the normal, what we have in a dossier, and that has to do with developmental toxicity, with repeated dose toxicity, with teratogenicity, carcinogenicity, and so on. And there we have data which show us a POD, a point of departure for the effect on rat spermatozoids. And so the margin of safety calculated, and it's 38, very low. So indeed, that is not safe. But since we do risk assessment, you can calculate what would then be acceptable in a body cream, and that would be then something like 2%. So what I want here to bring as a message is the following. We have to look indeed to substances that if they could be endocrine disruptors. But, and if it's necessary to ban them, we have to ban them. But it is not always necessary. Let us stay with science and not just to say, put it all on one heap and say, the moment that you have something negative, oh, it is forbidden. No, let us follow the scientific rules and let us use updated regulations following scientific developments. So when I want to put what I see, what ECHA is doing, that is looking to chemicals, they have the chemical legislation REACH. So it means that their task is classification and hazard, which they very well do. And they are involved in the REACH and the CLP. What we do for the SCCS is looking to cosmetic ingredients, and that is following the cosmetic legislation. And what we do is risk assessment. So we look to a safe dose, and we look to what is relevant for human health, and we try to be very rigorous in that, and we are very conservative. Now, my personal opinion, and there is a lot that is going on, and there is a lot saying SCCS will join ECHA. Well, we don't want it. And I must say it very clearly, and that is that we are an independent committee, and that is our strength, because we can give advice and we can follow science. We are not have to follow it, what the Commission is saying. So we are critical, and we are scientists together from all the different member states in Europe, and we want to act as an independent committee. And we follow robust scientific principles, and we invest in modern, human-relevant and animal-free methodology. And I hope that we will get the time in order to show that for cosmetic ingredients, that NGRA, the new generation risk assessment, using the different NAMs, so the new approach methodologies, that we can use them in a very dedicated way, but that we will get the time. And that this will be science that is used, and not just all put it on a heap and say it is all hazard and so it is gone. So that is what I had to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. Stay. I think you should stay, because what I might do is just ask you questions and then I will ask Petra. So let me just see how it goes. First of all, your students must love you, I think. That's number one. I mean, that's what I think.
Especially when they do exams.
Yeah, especially when they do exams. Oh, I bet you're, yeah, I bet, well, they're shaking in their boots. Thank you very, very much for your clarity, for very, very comprehensive presentation. There's a lot of questions come in. Perhaps what I will do is I will deal so to the audience, and I know that what I will say is that Vera will use the other camera to answer, so she's answering you directly as opposed to me, is ask these and then the ones that come in for Petra. And anything, Petra, that in those questions you might want to comment on, do scribble behind the scenes and then I can ask you afterwards. I think that will be the easiest. So the questions are down here. Your eye line will drop there. So I will read them out just because they're not visible to all of the audience. So the Endocrine Society submitted a response to the SCCS Committee on Resorcinol, which you talked about, identified as EDC. After consideration, responding to the Society, the SCCS maintained its position that Resorcinol was safe within certain limits. Now, it might be added to the REACH candidate list as a full EDC. What would happen in practice to that opinion regarding its use in cosmetics if it does get on the candidate list?
Well, that is up to what regulation will determine, because if it comes in the exceptions, then it would be that resorcinol can be used, but in the concentrations that are supposed to be safe. And of course, we have always, for cosmetics, we always look also to aggregate exposure. So it is not just the use of this ingredient in one particular, but it is in a whole gamma of products which can come on the market. So we will look to what does it mean in aggregate exposure. It's not only in the example, well, here resorcinol is now for air dyes, so there that is limited. But for example, if you have ingredients which are in a body lotion, they can be in a cream, they can be in different cosmetics. But for an air dye, that is limited. So for me, or they say it is an endocrine disruptor and they follow hazard, which I think is not very scientifically done. You can take that choice. That is something that will be done politically, and you know that the politics plays sometimes a very heavy role. But if you look to science, then you would say you can see what the concentration is which is safe, and so we use it, and there is no problem for the safety for the consumer.
Thank you. So how does the SCCS foresee evaluating BHA? Because the question is that there hasn't been able to get the requested information under REACH, so shouldn't BHA be put on the substance not to be used under cosmetics? Perhaps that would be a good case of one substance, one assessment. Yeah, but for us it is clear. We are not determining what comes on lists and so on. So we answer on a mandate that we get. So if there are concerns in different member states, the member states come together and they discuss what is of importance for them. So if one of the DGs, and usually it is DG Grow, picks it up and gives us a mandate that we should have a look to BHT and BHI, then we do that. So, but and so sometimes we do proactive, that we say you should have a look to this or that ingredient. But for the moment there is a lot of work, so we have our hands full with what we have to do for the moment. Because it's not only endocrine disruptor, it's different ingredients which we are looking at, depending on the questions that member states pose. Okay. Thank you. So here you can even read, I mean, I'm going to read it out for you. It's right in front, but again, I will read it out because it's good for the audience to hear. So the SCCS opinions, these are the longest questions and coming in, obviously, because of the explanation. The opinions on whether, for example, BP3 and octocrylene do not evaluate whether or not the substances are EDs, so hazard assessment. The SCCS has jumped to the risk assessment to derive a safe concentration, and this assessment is based on restricted data. Wouldn't it be better to apply a more rigid assessment and evaluate the potential ED properties and use more diverse data and therefore more properly evaluate the substance's potential ED properties? Well, then I think that the person that has asked that question, and sorry, that person and sorry if I am a bit rough, but I think that you should then very well look to the opinions. In the opinions, we have the local toxicity, so that are all the different tests that you can do, like skin irritation, eye irritation, sensitization, sun exposure. But then we have the systemic toxicity. We look to repeated dose toxicity, teratogenicity, developmental toxicity, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, genotoxicity. We look to everything. And in fact, when we do a risk assessment is based on first the hazard identification and characterization. It is then the dose response assessment and the exposure assessment. And these three together give risk assessment. So we look to everything. So saying that we jump on risk assessment, sorry,
then you don't know what risk assessment is. Yeah, it's rough, but it is like that.
I love it. Oh, God, you need to be ruling the world, I think, actually, Vera. So I'm going to read this next question now. How do you plan to continue the work in the SCCS in light of the chemical strategy with this shift to generic risk assessment, which is basically hazard-based approach? I believe most of us know the difference between hazard and risk, but...
That we are not going to do hazard approach. Hazard is a part of the whole risk assessment, and we look to hazard, that is clear, that is always in. But then we do risk assessment. But if we are obliged to change the whole thing, well, then that is saying that science is stupid and that we should do things which are not scientifically recognized. That's why we want to be independent, to follow the science, and to give our advice as independent scientists. And if this is not followed, well, politics can do what they want, but I think scientists cannot do what they want.
Thank you. How do you deal for risk assessment with EDs that are known to show non-monotonic dose response and effect at low dose?
Yeah, but if you have results, if you see in your results that at low doses you have problems, then it means that you have to see that. I'm not saying that when something is an endocrine disruptor that you should keep it. What I'm saying is that you should do your risk assessment and you should really think for what it is used, in what kind of products it can be, what is the exposure of the persons. And if you have with very low concentrations that you have problems, yeah, then I would be the first one to say you shouldn't use it.
Thank you. We have a last question that's come in, and then Petra, I'm going to ask you, because you saw there was, and I'm sure you've got some comments. So if you've got a new substance only used in cosmetics without historical in vivo data, how do you plan to test adverse effects? According to the WHO, that should be investigated in vivo, and cosmetics cannot be tested on animals.
Yeah, that is absolutely true, and that is the whole problem. And I would not start to ignore that. We know that when it is an absolutely new ingredient, that is an absolute problem, because there we don't have the no observable adverse effect level, that is clear. But I don't know if people realize that what we see as substances in the SCCS, that usually these are existing ingredients. And when the cosmetic industry talks of new products, it can be even a color of a box, it can be another perfume, it can be, but it is the existing ingredients which we know, which are put in a different formulation, which are putting in a different context, and so on. So what I have to say is that the cosmetic industry is very creative, but it is about safety and a real new ingredient. But what I've heard is that in November we would, from the industry, Cosmetics Europe has said that we would get a dossier, which would for the first time being done completely with alternative methods. So the NGRA will be there applied, and what they told us is that we will get a dossier completely in parallel. And right. I think that is the way forward, that you say we have a parallel dossier where you have the data, but then the other dossier which doesn't use them, but uses all the different alternative methodology. And if you see where you come and if that is feasible, these are case studies, but there need a lot of case studies before we can really say. And that's why I was saying, I hope that we will have the time to continue all the money and all the work that has been put in alternative methodologies, and that we are not going to be put 20, 30 years ago. So we are making progress, but science needs its time. And so we need to have the time to see. But if you see that organ on a chip, human on a chip, this is already used by the pharmaceutical industry. So we see that it is taken up, and also NGRA is a lot of interest in different areas. So I would say, let them go together, and it should not be in vitro, it should not be in vivo, it should be the best science, the combination of what you have for the moment. That is what is important in science, a combination and not a polarization, or it should be in vivo and in vitro, but we have our European legislation, which has for cosmetics no, so we have to wait until we can have completely new ingredients, until we can do it.
Okay, so the importance there, you said, on these new approaches, these new testing methodologies, and that again underscores protocols, I think, for those of you who were with us yesterday, exactly what we did here in those last 2 sessions, also from the OECD. It was a very complimentary last 2 sessions. I'm going to ask you to momentarily step, I mean, in the interest of time, actually, I might not invite you back, but let's see. You've been spectacular, literally, I use that word spectacular, and I'm going to invite in your colleague, please, because we'd love to hear from you again. Petra, there's a little bit of, I love that bit with the handhelds there. So if I can see that question that came in very first, I don't know if that's in your head, that came in from both of you. That was the first one about the Endocrine Society's response. But was that something you wanted to, or you felt that was adequately dealt with? You've got other things to address. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for letting me come back. Now, there were a lot of questions on resourcenol, so I hope they have been covered by Vera. And there are a lot of questions circulating on the risk, the hazard. They're all very similar in nature, so I hope by one sentence I can cover it all and conclude the session. But one thing that is sure is that the GRA approach is being extended, will be extended to endocrine disruptors. This is a reality. It's happening. Now, one option, as I said, could be to follow what we currently have in the cosmetics regulation for CMR provisions. So that could be one option, is that we duplicate and we use the same system. However, the CMRs also will be assessed, the approach we have will also be assessed, because now we need to take into account the essential use concept. Yeah. That's up to debate, and that is yet to be seen. There's a study on that, the discussions have just started, so it's very premature to say now how that could look. But there are numerous options, and I just wanted to assure the stakeholders that EDs will follow a GRA approach. There is no going back. Now, whether we will have some possibilities for exemptions, that is yet to be seen. But it's to say that the hazard approach doesn't have to stop there. It may stop there. For CMRs, let's be honest, very few get the exemptions that are requested. It hasn't happened very much, maybe once or twice in cosmetics. So the approach could be working very well, and it could be used for EDs. So either the story stops there, or there will be some kind of criteria for exemptions where then a specific risk assessment would take place. So we don't have more information than that, but I think it's still quite a lot of news from the last endocrine forum. And I think at the next, the fourth forum will be early next year, if I'm not mistaken, or mid-summer. Yeah. And I hope
before now next year. Yes, before September next year was my understanding.
Yes, it'll be earlier, I've been told. So I hope we'll have even more information there. And of course, we're following also the classification, hazard classification under CLP.
Okay, that was the longest sentence anybody has said, but it was a splendid sentence. No, I loved it. You said, how can I say it? Extremely clear. So I'm not joking with you unnecessarily, but thank you for your clarity. You were fabulous speakers, both of you, with your passion, your eloquence, and being so comprehensive. Was there anything else, or are you happy? I tell you what, I will say at this juncture, given the time, because there is that summary report coming out, if there is anything, because it is going to come to you, you are absolutely welcome to put in there what needs to be put in there. And of course, any tweaking to slides can also happen because those are available. So are you good? Am I good to release you? Have you said what you need to?
The cosmetics debate is always the fun one, the most popular one. So please don't hesitate to send me emails, or to Vera, of course, but from the regulatory aspect, please send them directly to me. I also have other competent colleagues that we can address all your questions.
Okay.
So, with pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so very much to you, Petra. Thank you very much to Vera. You've been splendid. I can release you both. And I love you. Just peeking behind the EU flag there. That's just tremendous. But don't mess with those women. And I say that in the most fabulous way. Absolutely. Okay. You better not mess with our next speaker either. I'm just looking across there. You're laughing. So we do have a last session, and then I am going to ask our head of unit, Christina De Avila, to come back. I'm certainly not going to make her talk for so long as the beginning, but just in 3 or 4 minutes to round off. But we do have a very important last session. It features 2 speakers. The first one is with me. He will present, we'll have some questions. The second is going to join online. So can we see perhaps if we can get that name slide there? I know it takes just there. There we go. There's both of our speakers. We're going to start with Klaus. He's coming in now. We're going to come to Jose. So Dr. Klaus Behrendt, you are going to provide our audience with some updates on ED and pesticides and biocides regulation. So that's nice, complementary to cosmetics. And then your colleague is going to talk about something a little different. So let me give you the time to present. And that is your camera, sir. Thank you.
Thank you,
very
Katrina.
much.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. And Katrina, I hope that you're also happy to be joined by a male speaker on the stage, just as you were to be joined by a female
I'm
speaker.
so happy, Dr. Klaus. I'm
session.
so happy.
And I'm also abusing a little bit my position here to say 2 sentences to Professor Roriers, whose presentation I really liked a lot. I mean, the first one, and this is for my area, the pesticides, the plant protection products, and biocides, the decision that the approval criteria are partly hazard-based, and for the bigger part, risk-based, has been taken by the legislators. But I don't think we can say that this is not scientific. It is a societal choice to say some hazards are so bad that we want to regulate them on the basis of hazard. Others can be done under risk assessment. And as long as the determination of the hazards is science-based, it's still science-based. And the second remark is a defense of ECHA. ECHA, for its scientific opinions, does not follow instructions from the Commission. I mean, ECHA is very independent in formulating its scientific opinions. But now on to my subject area. So the plant protection products and the biocidal products have always been front runners when it comes to endocrine disruptor assessments and also the approval criteria or the regulation of them. In these 2 regulations, it was the first really expressly introduced into legislation. So we were also the first areas to have new science-based criteria to determine when substances are endocrine disruptors. And they apply since November 2018 for plant protection products and since May 2018 for the biocidal products. And they are being applied in ongoing procedures. And that's on this first slide, which I'm not going to present in great detail. So just the message is that our assessments take about 3 years, our evaluation procedures. And the moment the criteria came into being, they were applied, and they have been applied retroactively to the dossiers that were already in the workflow. But that means, of course, also that for some of them, a break had to be taken to ask for extra data. And for that, we have even amended the regulation that governs the process to give the possibility to EFSA to request the additional data. And when EFSA applies this so-called clock stop to ask for additional data, the applicants can also submit information related to the derogation possibilities from the hazard-based bans. And these are when there is negligible exposure and when the use of a substance is absolutely essential to combat a given plant pest. Now, let's look at some statistics, and I'm not going to read the names of all the substances on these slides, and the slides will become available afterwards, so you can read for yourself. Just to mention the headline figure, that EFSA has completed the evaluation of 25 substances with regard to their ED properties over the past 3 years. And for 2021, you see an 8 on this slide. Obviously, 2021 is not yet over, so we expect that a few more of these evaluations will be concluded. EFSA has used the provision for this, the so-called clock stop provision, to ask additional data many times for these dossiers that were already in the workflow. In 8 cases, it was just the minimum, the 3-month period, because EFSA could already conclude on the ED properties based on the available data, and the 3 months were just there for applicants to address the derogation possibilities that I mentioned earlier. For 42 substances, the clock stop is ongoing. And they are all listed on this slide. And the maximum period available is 30 months. And this has been done on the basis of what kind of tests could be required. And if you look at an extended one-generation study, for example, 30 months is really the minimum that is necessary to set up the study, contract it, and have it executed, and then have the results available. So depending on what kind of data are missing, these clock stop periods can be quite substantial. Now, what have been the results so far? And here, of the 25 substances, you have the results on this slide. For the 25 substances that have been evaluated and completed, 9 were found to be endocrine disruptors for human health, and 4 were found to be endocrine disruptors for the environment, or for non-target organisms, as it's called in the regulation. And 4 of them had ED properties for both human health and non-target organisms. And I really want to mention that very explicitly, 9 out of 25. I think this is a reassuring result so far, because at the time when the criteria were adopted, there were many concerned thinking that they are too strict or that they put the bar too high, meaning that almost no substance would be identified as an endocrine disruptor. And the results so far show that that is not the case. 9 out of 25 is quite a considerable number. And of those, I should probably mention the 2 for which the EFSA conclusions are already published, mancozeb and clofentezine. For the others, the EFSA conclusions are still not yet published. They are adopted but not yet published. And for mancozeb, we have in the meantime also banned its use already in plant protection products. And on this slide, you have the 16 substances for which EFSA found that they are not endocrine disruptors, neither for human health nor for the non-target organisms. And the links to the EFSA conclusions are also included directly in the slide. One thing that we are working on in this area, in addition to the actual substance assessments or evaluations, are updating the data requirements. And we do have in our regulations that set out the data requirements for plant protection products the clear obligation for applicants to provide data on endocrine disrupting properties. And how this is to be done, also for the other hazards that are part of the dossiers, is set out in Commission communications that list the test methods and that list the relevant guidance documents. And we started to update these communications in 2018. But after a first consultation round with member states and stakeholders, we got more than 600 comments, most of them not related to the issue of endocrine disruptors, but to other parts, because the communications had never been updated since 2013. And we are currently finalizing the analysis of all these comments and will launch another round of consultation with stakeholders and member states in the near future to then hopefully finalize this update very soon. But I would also like to underline that in the meantime already, the guidance document that EFSA and ECHA have developed for the endocrine disruptor criteria applies in full. And when EFSA asks for additional data or when applicants prepare new dossiers, they have to apply this guidance already now, even though it's not yet listed in these communications. Let me now move to the biocidal products. Here, the scientific body that adopts the opinions or conducts the evaluation is ECHA. And we have adopted opinions from ECHA on 23 substances so far. 3 have been identified as endocrine disruptors, and they are listed here. And 4 have been identified as not being endocrine disruptors. So again, we have quite a proportion of those that have been identified to be EDs. And on this slide, you have the names of all the substances for which ECHA could actually not conclude. So a situation a bit similar to what we heard in the presentation by Professor Horiers. The data available were not sufficient to conclude whether the substance is an endocrine disruptor or not. And that is possible under the Biocidal Products Regulation when the dossier was submitted a long time ago. And many of you might be aware that the work on the evaluation of active substances under the BPR is quite delayed, and we've also stated that clearly in the report that we published in June. So when the dossier was submitted a long time ago, there was no obligation to address endocrine disruptor properties, and the ECHA can also not ask for additional data to complete that assessment. So the opinion has to be formulated on the basis of what is available, and for many of them, it's not conclusive. And on this slide, you see the status of this review program for all active substances, where only 42% have been completed so far, and the other 58% not yet. They are all in workflow, and 128 substances are under evaluation. And for those that were submitted a long time ago, of which there are still quite a few, we have to work with the data, or ECHA has to work with the data that are in the dossiers. For the others, ECHA can also ask for additional data to be produced and is doing so. On the contrary, we have made good progress in updating the data requirements. So what has to go into a dossier for applications. And the Commission delegated regulation that updated the data requirements was adopted in May this year. And the link is included also on this slide. In addition, we have worked with the Member States authorities and ECHA to find agreement on a number of questions that have come up in relation to the evaluation of applications for approval of substances or biocidal products. And one of those concerns the presence of impurities in substances when these impurities are identified as endocrine disruptors. And here the conclusion is that if such impurities are present, then the active substance is to be considered as an ED unless the tests have been conducted with the substance as it is, including this impurity, and have shown absence of endocrine disrupting effects. We also had a discussion on how to go about the so-called disinfection byproducts, so substances that are generated when a disinfectant is applied, for example, to water, to prepare drinking water. And here the conclusion is, as such byproducts are not in the biocidal product itself, but are only generated later, then they do not lead to the consideration that the product has endocrine disrupting properties, but the byproduct generated is still part of the overall risk assessment. We've also worked on the non-active substances, or the so-called co-formulants in the products, which is, again, different from the PPP area, the plant protection products area. There, all the rules relate to the active substance only, whereas for biocidal products, the rules concern active substances and co-formulants, or the non-active substances. And here, we have discussed a lot with our REACH colleagues also, and the member states were very keen to have the assessment of the endocrine disrupting properties of the co-formulants done under REACH. So we have worked with ECHA to develop a concept paper on how this assessment of the co-formulants would be integrated into the REACH processes for assessing endocrine disrupting properties. And the link to the document is also on this slide. And ECHA has made available an inventory of co-formulants that are frequently used in biocidal products based on the information available, and has classified them or has given indications on whether they could be ED or not ED, or totally unclear. And this is available for the member states authorities when they conduct their assessments. When biocidal products are authorized, that can also happen at union level, so via the Commission, not only at the member state level. And here we had an interesting discussion with member states how to go about the situation when we know that some of the co-formulants in such a product could be endocrine disruptors. And we have come to an agreement that when there are significant indications that a co-formulant is an endocrine disruptor, we will put the name out publicly in the so-called product assessment report. And we also include a recital in the Commission decision granting the union authorization that says that this co-formulant might be an endocrine disruptor. And the idea is, of course, that then the producers of the biocidal products have an incentive to substitute this co-formulant with another one. And another interesting development is that we asked ECHA to conduct risk assessments for 2 of the substances that were identified as endocrine disruptors, and in particular to assess whether there is a threshold, a safety threshold for them. Because we have a derogation possibility under the Biocidal Products Regulation that makes a comparison between the effect on society of not using the substance and the remaining risk that might be posed by that substance. So in order to be able to make that comparison, we need to have an idea about the magnitude of the risk that the continued use would pose. And ECHA is currently working on this. And then we have also triggered what is called early reviews of existing approvals. So we have looked at all the active substances that have gone through the process and were approved, and asked ourselves which one of those, or for which one of those do we have indications that they might be endocrine disruptors. And we found 3, iodine, PVP, iodine, and ZNAP. And we triggered an early review of the approval to get confirmation of this, and we gave a mandate to ECHA to provide us opinions. And the way that ECHA does that is it looks at the member state who did the original evaluation and asks that member state to conduct also the endocrine disruptor evaluation to come to an opinion. And Ireland has accepted to do that for ZNAP, but we are still waiting for Sweden to confirm that Sweden will also do this for iodine and PVP iodine, as they were the evaluating member state for these substances. And the mandate that we gave to ECHA is publicly available also. And then last slide, we are also, together with EFSA and ECHA, providing training to the member state risk assessors in order to teach and improve knowledge about the criteria and how to assess the data that are used for that purpose. So we had several training events in February 2019 and November 2019. Then in 2020, a break due to the COVID pandemic. But we will have another training seminar now in December 2021. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And here's also a link where you can find more information on our activities.
Good Lord, you did that very comprehensively and concisely. We'll take a moment for the interpreters to breathe. Thank you. Actually, I would have, if I'd had the time, I would have had a conversation between you and Vera, because that would have been, instead of you having to talk to her off, you know, I could have stayed, we could have just moderated a conversation. That would be an interesting one. But for next time, maybe that could be an adjunct to the fourth annual forum. But on a serious note about that, and that what you said at the outset, you know, we heard, you know, we've got ECHA, we've got, you know, classification and hazard, we've got SCCS, we've got safe dose human risk assessment, we've got the commission and all of that relationship. I mean, how does all that fit together? You've got all of these DGs, directorates general who are involved, and, you know, with the consumer, me, on the other end. How should I see all of that, all of the independent science, all of those different viewpoints?
No, I mean, for the Commission, I think you are in safe hands, because we have an incredible amount of exchanges with our colleagues in DG Environment, in DG Grow, in all the relevant DGs. So the Commission is really aligned on that. I might have personal views that are different, but they are not relevant. When it comes to the scientific opinions from the agencies, you have a point. It can be confusing. And we have a case at the moment under Biocides, which is not linked to endocrine disruption, where the same active substance that is used in food contact materials has been assessed by ECHA and found not safe, and EFSA has found it safe. And here I agree with you, this is confusing. And that is why we are big fans of the one substance, one assessment, and maybe one hazard assessment only in the beginning, but in the case of the food contact materials, it's the full assessment, because the use is the same. The use is absolutely the same. So the two agencies have come to different results, and we are looking into that together with them to see what can be done to avoid such a situation that is indeed confusing. I agree with you.
Thank you. So let's have a look at some questions for you. I'm just looking down here, and again, for the benefit of our audience, you are welcome to respond directly rather than at me. I think you can see some of them, which I will just briefly read. So with regard to ED submitted for BPR dossiers pending evaluation, is the data protection period extended beyond 2025, and where can we find the list? It's pretty tricky to find the information. So you may address that speaker there.
I mean, for this you have to differentiate. I mean, for the substances that are already approved, the Biocidal product authorization is ongoing or has already been done, and the data requirements refer always to the moment of the product authorization. For the ones where the assessment is still ongoing, and these are the ones, the pending evaluation, there is the so-called Article 95 list, which indicates clearly which companies are entitled to place active substances or biocidal products on the market because they have access to a full data dossier. Other companies cannot just sell substances like that. And as long as the evaluation is pending, this Article 95 list continues.
Okay, thank you. So picking up a little bit, well, now talking transparency, but picking up in all of this interplay between the Commission and the various authorities and agencies, here is something that somebody sent in. We'd like to see better transparency in order to inform stakeholders about the status of substances that are being evaluated currently or they're already identified as endocrine disruptors. ECHA provides substance-specific information, REACH BPR, here on the website, but is there going to be a comparable EFSA website or a list for pesticides?
Good suggestion that I will take back to EFSA. I mean, as put on one of my slides, the EFSA conclusions are always published. So you can find the information for the substances concerned, but in a way you need to know, I agree. So I'll take this back to EFSA, and maybe that's something that they could consider doing, to provide links from such a page on outcomes to the already published conclusions. Good idea. Yeah.
Thank you. I love the way you looked at me and said good idea when it wasn't mine. It just happened that the eye line was to me, but I'll take it, you know, Klaus.
Well,
I will.
You are my audience. So,
yeah, I am. Isn't that sad? Oh, when is that going to change? But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. So regarding byproducts, we have a question there. Are they considered for the risk part, but not the hazard part of the evaluation?
No. I mean, the hazards of the byproducts are also assessed in order to be able to do the risk assessment. As Professor Rios explained, you have to start with the hazard assessment and then look at the exposure to come to the risk assessment, clearly.
So let's have a look. I think we've got one that's we're just making it, it's just being, what would we say? I was about to say chipoté, because that's the only word that I could come
fumbled with.
Oh, I think elaborated upon, clarified. So we will I'm just going to wait for that last question to come in. And then, of course, what I will remind us all is that we do have a further speaker who's going to complement all of our previous speakers before we close. So in case more MOCs, more than one constituent substance concept, is to be applied to the CLP, will it challenge the fact that ED impurities does not confer ED status to the AS when data is available for the whole active substance?
Here I like to quote Churchill: forecasts are notoriously difficult, in particular if they concern the future. So let's wait and see what's coming out of the MOCs and the CLP, and then we will see whether we have to review, align. We had consulted what we put into that document that is on our slide with our colleagues from Environment and GROW and ECHA and everybody. So if that changes in the future, we are perfectly prepared to realign.
Okay, thank you.
In order to avoid that confusion that you mentioned earlier.
You're very good. You should moderate. You probably do moderate, don't you? Okay, so
I chair many meetings with widely diverging views. Indeed.
It's you need a flak jacket mentally, I think, for that one. So what else? Here we go. Are we there? We got one more question.
After EFSA.
After EFSA, indeed. Okay.
So that's for Jose.
So indeed,
good
that's for Jose. Thank you very much. So
Yeah.
we'll just wait. We'll park it there for a moment. Thank you so much.
You're
you can
very
take a
welcome.
seat momentarily. If there are more questions and we have just a moment, then I will ask you to come back. Thank you so much, Klaus. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it does remain for me now to introduce our last speaker before I invite back Christina from the Commission. So our last speaker, let's have a look if a slide can be put there for Dr. Jose Tarazona. So there we go, Scientific Officer at the European Food Safety Authority. So he is going to come and share EFSA's opinion on NMDR, which is, of course, non-monotonic dose response. And when I say, of course, I promise, because obviously I, as a non-expert, did look up what that was instead of just spouting the acronym. So we have you with us here. Thank you. You're on screen. I'm going to give you some time to present. We'll go a little bit over 6 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen, for the end, but I'm going to give you the floor now, Jose, and pop back at the end and see what questions we may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you and good afternoon to everybody. I hope that you can hear me.
Oh, we need to hear you a bit more, actually. Can you push the volume up?
Should be now better?
Oh, much better.
Much better. Okay.
Thank you. And may I please plead with you, not too fast. I'd rather you took 3 more minutes and slowed down than too fast. Thank you so much. There we go.
Thank you very much. So first, I would like to acknowledge and accept this. Yes, I thank the European Commission and particularly DG Environment for inviting EFSA to this third annual forum on endocrine disruptors. I'm not going to talk about endocrine disruptor as such, but non-monotonic dose responses. And I saw that even before my presentation, there was already in the chat some questions and comments related to that. So I hope that my presentation will be also of interest for the audience. May I have the next slide, please? So the concept of non-monotonicity is a key concept in toxicology. The question is that normally in the dose response, we observe the response moving in one direction. Non-monotonicity means that in one point in the dose response, there is a shift. We see there's a change in the slope, meaning that if the response was going down, now suddenly at higher doses start to go up, or the opposite, as you can see in the slide, it could be in figure B, the response was going up and a particular dose start to go down. The definition that we are using for non-monotonicity are several, but normally we are using the one that we are using in this opinion is the one for Van der Bergen et al. In 2012. And the question is that non-monotonicity is particularly relevant for chemicals that act through receptors, so what we call receptor-mediated chemicals. And obviously endocrine disruptors are part of it. So it's not exclusive to endocrine disruptors. There are many chemicals that are not endocrine disruptors that have non-monotonic responses, but it's particularly relevant also in this area. May I have my next slide, please? The question of non-monotonicity has been also associated with the idea of low doses, the need to identify potential effects at doses close to once humans are exposed. And this has been something that in EFSA has taken some activity, already started 9 years ago. In 2012, EFSA decided to organize a scientific colloquium to discuss non-monotonicity and the link in with the low doses. Following the conclusions of the colloquium, we saw that this is a relevant area in which additional scientific information is needed. So we asked to run a systematic review through external, that was published in 2016 as an external report that was later complemented by some activities in ANSES that published a new method to assess statistically non-monotonicity, and by Cheviolet et al. That were two scientific publications linked to that. Once the information was available in September 2019, the EFSA Scientific Committee decided to have a self-mandate to continue and to check specifically the consequences of this non-monotonicity in the EFSA risk assessments. Following the practice for transparency and engagement, we published a draft for a public consultation that ran from December last year until February this year. And since February until today, the scientific committee and the working group has been working on the assessment of all the comments and updating the opinion accordingly. And I'm happy to inform you that the opinion has been adopted this morning by the scientific committee, and that means that it could be published in the coming weeks. And in addition to the scientific opinion, we, according to EFSA practice, will publish a technical report covering the public consultation, meaning all the comments that has been received, but also a specific responses for every single comment, how this comment has been addressed during the finalization of the scientific opinion. Next slide. I will just summarize the terms of reference. We were looking for a scientific opinion on the biological relevance. The methodology that were included in the systematic review and the probabilistic assessment were methodologies to assess statistically or visually if there was no monotonicity. That was already covered there, so the terms of reference for the scientific opinion, and as a consequence, the content of the scientific opinion cover how to assess the biological relevance, focusing on the in vivo observations for non-monotonicity, and in particular to address the consequences for the human health risk assessments that are conducted by EFSA. Obviously, that we are not trying to cover everything related to non-monotonicity, but what is the role of observations of a non-monotonicity when EFSA is conducting the risk assessments. Next slide. Just for completeness, but I will not enter into the details, you see here the very specific terms of reference that focus on biological relevance and biological plausibility. Next slide. And that were complemented with how this biological plausibility can be integrated for the adverse effects that are pivotal in EFSA risk assessments, because obviously that is the key interest. Next slide. In the interpretation of the terms of reference, it was very clear from the beginning that for some substances, and the typical example are nutrients, we always have, if we look to the adversity, a non-monotonic response. The situation of the U curve for the dose response for nutrients is very clear. At low doses, below the acceptable range of intake, you have always effects because of the efficiency. At higher doses, you see effects on toxicity. So obviously, these are normal practice from decades in the risk assessment for nutrients, so there was no need to provide any additional recommendation there. In addition, the working group and the scientific committee decided to exclude other effects that are not relevant for the risk assessment, in particular kind of beneficial effects like for pharmaceuticals or other chemicals in the area, but also hormesis effects when there is an indication of a possible adaptation or a kind of beneficial effects at low doses before the actual adverse effects start. Obviously, those are not relevant for the risk assessment perspective and are not addressed in the scientific opinion. Next slide, please. Just a summary of the data and the methodology that has been used by EFSA for this assessment. Regarding the data, obviously we focus on substances that are relevant for EFSA, so those that are used in the food and feed area. That was the basis of the systematic review that was published in 2016. Because we're already 3 years from the publication, we complement this review with a search, literature search conducted directly by the working group. We retrieve more than 200 additional articles, and we selected about 19 in particular. And also we have specific searches for bisphenol A and for the phthalates, because that's were the example that we decided to use for the case studies. For the methodology, the opinion is based on 2 approaches. The statistical and visual approaches are those that were developed before and are included in the recommendations of the reference in the terms of reference. So the external report by Bosole et al. And the probabilistic assessment by Chevilot et al. But what we add to the statistical and visual approaches is the biological plausibility and the relevance for the risk assessment that was based on the expert judgment by the working group, and is explained for every single example in the scientific opinion that will be published very, very soon. Next slide, please. As already indicated, the public consultation is one of the essential elements for getting additional information. We ran this between December and last year and February this year. We got 25 contributors, not only from Europe, also from the US and from Japan, with 45 comments during these 9 weeks consultations. Next slide. You can see that the large majority of the comments were for international organizations, national research authorities, and public institutions in the EU and outside the EU, but there was also significant contribution from the private sector industry, as well as consultants and others. A large majority of the comments were on the conclusions. That is as expected, because that is the more important part, as well as the elements related to the impact of the observed non-monotonicity and the risk assessment process, because in the draft, the scientific committee already suggested the methodology or an approach to be used in the risk assessment, and that will receive a significant number of comments, as well as general comments on the approach. As already mentioned, in addition to the scientific committee, we will publish a report with every single comment that has been received, as well as how this every single comment has been addressed during the finalization of the scientific opinion. Next. So let's have a short introduction. You will be able to read the full opinion in the coming weeks, but just main findings. First, non-monotonicity obviously is a plausible phenomenon that for some endpoints has a very well-defined biological explanation. For example, for effects on beneficial nature, or for also adverse effects linked to motor stimulation or activities, it's clear that for the endpoint itself, independently of what is the chemical, you can already anticipate that most likely there will be a non-monotonic response. the stimulation cannot go up, 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 and up. There is a moment that toxicity is so high that there is no longer stimulation, just to put an example. But nevertheless, non-monotonicity can be also observed for other endpoints, that there is not a well-defined biological explanation that will be linked to the specific effects of that particular chemical, and in those cases, there is a need to have a plausibility assessment. An additional finding is that there is no gold standard for the statistical assessment of non-monotonicity. There are several methods, and what is important to mention in real practice, not when you do the risk assessment and assess the available information, there are two main areas that create concerns to address if the monotonicity of lack of monotonicity is real or just apparent. One is non-monotonicity driven by single dose groups. So it's a single dose group that trigger the full lack of monotonicity. And the second are very unrealistic shapes when the response is going up, down again, that biologically is very difficult to explain. And those may be just related to chance events. And obviously those are elements to be considered in the weight of evidence when doing the risk assessment. There is also an important element here is that the non-monotonicity may appear at different levels, so may appear at any point in the dose response. So not only is not a low dose phenomenon, may occur as also at very high doses, and also may occur for any kind of endpoints, very early, even molecular initiating events, intermediate events not yet considered adverse, or the apical effects that are the ones that usually are considered adverse are used for setting points of the points of the part of the point of reference for the assessment. And again, just to reiterate, is particularly relevant for all receptor-mediated chemicals, including endocrine disruptors. Next slide, please. Based on these findings, the scientific committee is proposing a methodology to assess the impact of the observed non-monotonicity during the risk assessment process. The first element is to consider in which end of the dose response curve monotonicity is observed. If it is observed at the upper end of the dose, normally the risk assessment can continue as normal because will not affect the selection of the reference point or the point of departure for the assessment of the risk of the substance. However, when the non-monotonicity is observed at the lower end, so connected to the possibility for effects at low doses, the specific considerations are needed to address non-monotonicity during the risk assessment approach. First is to identify the kind of effects for which non-monotonicity is observed. We are talking about apical effects that can be considered adverse, or early or immediate effects or events that need to have a pathway for the adversity. In the case of apical effects, one of the key elements is to avoid or to have additional experimental information or consider the weight of evidence to differentiate between real non-monotonicity from chance events linked to a single study. For early or intermediate events, the additional considerations are more complex, require the assessment of the type of evidence, biological relevance, and also the pathway for the adversity, and obviously the use of adverse outcome pathway is suggested. Next slide, please. The recommendations go to when evidence for non-monotonicity in apical effects is observed, should be assessed in terms of both statistical rigor, but also the biological plausibility. It should be important to consider that non-monotonicity for the apical effects may be a result of the interaction of two modes of actions, and the mode of action may be monotonic, but simply one appears at different doses than the other one, and as a consequence of the second mode of action that appears at high doses, you can see a change in the apical effects. When the effects is observed at low doses, and if these effects is considered adverse, it's clear that this is the effect to be used as reference point for the risk assessment. In the case of a non-monotonicity observed at early molecular initiated events or intermediate events, the key element is to see what are the plausibility for propagating the effects through apical effects that are relevant and to assess the adversity. And one of the additional considerations is that we have the opposite situation. We can see non-monotonicity for the molecular initiating events or for the intermediate events, but that does not necessarily means that you see non-monotonicity also for the apical effects. So there is a need to consider non-monotonicity for each group of effects and then to see the pathway for the adversity considering the information available on the mode of action of the substance or the mechanistic information that may be available. And obviously opinion is suggesting the use of new approach methodologies, avoiding the use of additional animals, and also providing mechanistic information in order to differentiate the situation when additional information is needed. Next slide. Just to conclude, in the opinion, the scientific committee decided to have 2 case studies, one on bisphenol A and the second on phthalates, in particular with the DESP. And those case studies are detailed. It's not the risk assessment of these substances, it's just to assess the role, if any, of non-monotonicity in the risk assessment. And the conclusions for BPA is that, yeah, there are some observations for some effects of non-monotonicity in some studies, but there is a lack of consistency between the different studies and even link effects in the same studies with similar observations. And following which are the effects for which non-monotonicity has been observed, the conclusion is that these effects are not relevant for the risk assessment. So basically, for the risk assessment there is of a BPA, there is no need to consider non-monotonicity. The situation is the opposite, and I think that it will be that obviously we have no clue at the beginning when we selected the cases, but the situation is different for DEHP. In this case, based on the available evidence that has been assessed by the working group and the scientific committee, we have been able to identify a possible non-monotonic dose response for postnatal testosterone levels that may be linked to different adverse effects and maybe, so we are not doing the risk assessment here. That is something to be done later on in parallel, and in fact the work is already ongoing. But in this, the risk assessment of the EHP, there is a need to consider the likelihood for non-monotonicity and the role of this possible non-monotonicity during the risk assessment process. Next slide. I think that was the last one. So if there are any questions, I will be happy to try to answer and to address any questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. And that was, wow, and very technical. So I can't even pretend to ask you loads of questions from it, apart from one that I'll ask after this one that has come in from the audience. And thank you, because there are still 200 people online right until the end. So it is fantastic that you have stayed with us for this whole journey. We are going to close in about 8 minutes, I would say, so just stay with us. Very precise there. The Endocrine Society did send a response to EFSA in March of this year on the consultation, and can you advise, please, when the full report will be available and whether there will be actually a possibility to reply on NMDRs?
Well, one of these 25 organizations that sent comments that I have mentioned in my presentation is the Endocrine Society. We have addressed every single comment, not only from the Endocrine Society, but for others, and then will publish at the same time that the scientific opinion with all the responses. So it's difficult to, it's just the editorial activity, but will be in October. We will publish the scientific, so the final scientific opinion and a report with the comments, and in that report will include all the observations on how we have modified the scientific opinion according to the comments from the Endocrine Society, but also from all the others. Regarding the possibility for a response, the opinion is adopted and will be published, but obviously there are always possibilities to contact EFSA in case that the Endocrine Society or any other stakeholder want to send comments. We will be happy to receive those, but we are not going to reopen the opinion unless we are convinced that there are significant errors there is a methodology and a process for that.
Okay, so did I catch in that you said October? Was that? Yeah, October of this year.
Has been approved today, this morning.
Okay.
So now we are going to the process to publish as soon as possible.
Okay, editorial activity I caught there. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have another question, please, from the audience. BPA's adverse effect on endpoint, is it relevant, not relevant for risk assessment? Any highlights?
From the assessment, obviously, what we are talking about, the information that has been retrieved, so there is a parallel assessment of BPA. Obviously, in science, you can never exclude that there is new information that means that we need to change the opinion, the scientific opinion of the scientific assessment. But for the information that we have observed and we have addressed, for a BPA, the endpoint, there are the endpoints for which non-monotonicity has been predicted, or the way that the doses that this has been observed do not trigger any modification in the risk assessment. So the non-monotonicity, with the information available today, seems not to be not relevant for the risk assessment of BPA.
Okay, and I do have another question, but you can slow down a little bit if you want, just to give some breathing space, or not least for our interpreters. Are NMDR curves reasonably stable when the exposure pattern changes? So, for example, from one shot to repeated doses or continuous exposure?
Well, that's one of the elements. The information that is available, because is quite limited. The problem with the for the assessment of non-monotonicity, and this is also highlighted in the opinion with some recommendations for international modification, you need to have sufficient number of doses in your approach. And also, when you start to do combination of modifying the doses or modifying the approach, then you have very complex situations. The way to address this is to have a weight of evidence, and there is also an EFSA guidance on how to do the weight of evidence. You combine results from different studies that address different level of exposure, continuous or not continuous, and also different doses on different group of animals, and you put all together the information to try to extract the scientific knowledge there.
Okay. Thank you. And we've got more questions coming in, obviously, just as you are responding to those that have already been posted. So here is one. At what stage of development are the non-animal methods for identifying these non-monotonic dose responses? Are they still very early, or are there any promising projects in the making?
I think that there are promising projects. We have also a parallel project that I have the honor to coordinate in EFSA to check with specific case studies how we can use already these new approaches in regulatory risk assessment with very good results. So we expect that already next year we start to have some specific examples and indications for recommendations. And particularly for the assessment of non-monotonicity, this is even a need, because getting mechanistic information in the in vivo studies is very difficult.
Right.
And if you combine available in vivo studies, looking to the apical effects, with new approach methodologies based on in silico, read across, and in vitro, with some in vitro methods, that will be very, very good. And as like Professor Rogers mentioned, there are a lot of approaches now used for pharmaceuticals, and we do that are in current practice. So there are a lot of options that we are quite optimistic that very soon we will be able to integrate new approaches in the regulatory risk assessment by EFSA, and that is part of our scientific strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. And I trust that people can get their hands on your slides, and that if they have more questions, because this is relatively new, and I hope you would be happy to respond to any individual questions that might come in after this event. Would that be fair for me to say to the audience?
Yes, absolutely. And also, once the opinion is published, I will be happy to receive any comments, suggestions, or recommendations on the opinion.
Thank you so much. And also special thanks for your patience for speaking right at the end. It is the toughest slot, but we did have consistent audience numbers, so at least you know that there were lots and lots of people listening in. Thank you very much for that. Just before I invite back Christina, I do need to invite back Klaus just momentarily, our previous speaker, because we do have a question that's come in, and it's a question from ExxonMobil. I'd already posed one to Christina this morning. So Klaus, do you know, I so miss you on this stage. I need you to come back. You're here.
It's with pleasure.
So here we go. A final question. Different wording for the ED-CLP classes are being considered compared to the PPP and BRD-ED, because it's going to produce confusion and inconsistency.
This is in principle the same question as we had on the MOX earlier, and the answer is the same. We will see. Let's see what comes out of the CLP process. In the end, what is being agreed. And we have anyway a review clause in our ED criteria for PPP and BPR. And then we will take into account what has happened on the CLP, obviously, when we do that review.
Okay, thank you. You stretched your legs for that. You may stretch them going off stage, because you're not allowed to share the stage at the same time in proximity as our last speaker.
Even though nobody disinfected the slide mover.
I was doing it in a miming fashion. May I now please invite back from the European Commission, DG Environment, Christina De Avila, who is coming back to not spend quite as long as an hour, but who is going to help me round off proceedings. So if you say, just so that at least the audience doesn't catch so much of our profiles, they'll catch a bit of you. You can talk to me, but they'll not catch so much of the profile. Very simple, 3 very simple questions. The first is, in that plethora of information, is there 2 or 3 slowly, key messages that you want to deliver to our audience who are still with us? And that's your camera.
2 or 3 key messages.
Just really short that they should take away. And indeed, if you're there, that's great.
I need to be here, yeah. So I think from what we've learned in these 2.5 days of the Endocrine Disruptor Forum, I think we have seen how much we have advanced in terms of knowledge, but still how much we still need to do. So both in terms of scientific knowledge, and we had very interesting insight yesterday on information, new scientific information on prenatal developmental effects that you have mentioned before, in particular with related to obesity. So we can see how big is the challenge ahead of us, which we are, of course, committed to reach. And we have also explained yesterday how we are, through our research program, committed to reach this gap. But also today, from the regulatory perspective, how we have taken very seriously, from a regulatory perspective, the calls from scientists, but also from the citizenship, in order to take action. And that's what we have done with the chemical strategy, and we have a very extensive program for endocrine disruptors.
Okay. I have another 2 for, again, some nutshell responses so that we keep our lovely audience with us right to the end. Progress. Director Kęstutis Sadauskas yesterday spoke at the opening, measured urgency. I've said this a few times, reiterating that chemicals contribute to our welfare, not all of them do. Stressing that crucial interplay between science and policy. This has been a long road. Feels like it's having momentum. How do you see progress at EU level? Where do you feel quite confident? And even amongst the wider stakeholder community, how do you see the progress?
Well, I do think that we have made a lot of progress in the last years, and in particular under this Commission. I think the sense of urgency has been there, and it has increased pace in the last decade. In terms of endocrine disruptors, we have seen it for at least 20 years, how it's increasing the pace and the momentum. And I think for us it culminated with the strategy. So I do think that we are in a good place to bring together some actions for the future, and to make things change and work differently. So I do think that there is this momentum that we have gained, and that I see it has been it's presented programmatically in the strategy, but then now we need to make it a reality, and make the necessary review of our revisions of our legislation in order to make it happen.
Okay,
I need to look there.
Well, listen, no, as long as you're generally looking at it is complete. We have a plethora, that word has already been used, I think, by Petra today. We have a plethora of cameras. It is a bit strange. Last question, sticking with Ps. I talked about progress, priorities. That question, in fact, came in, I think, twice from the audience yesterday for different speakers in terms of where would you place a priority? Because there are so many things to think about, to continue to research, and it is complicated and it is huge. So if you had to say, Katrina, this is what I feel amongst all of it, should be the priority, what would it
Well,
be?
I think in terms of research priorities, there were some very good ideas yesterday. So I'm going to focus on the regulatory priorities, and in order to give a response, to that progress, that need of progress that you were mentioning before, in your second P. So I think the priorities from my side are two, if I can say. First is to be able to identify the substances for their intrinsic properties, and for that we'll need to do it horizontally for all pieces of legislation, and we are engaged to do that through the revision of the CLP and the inclusion of these two new hazard classes. Obviously, in order to make that happen, we need to have the data from companies so we are capable of identifying. So this is our first priority, really know what it's out there. And then comes the second priority, which is to have a more preventive approach. And that's what the strategy has established. We need to have a more preventive approach, in particular for consumers. So with that, we will bring a stronger legislation to protect consumers, while at the same time start to jumpstart the innovation into safe and sustainable chemicals, which I explained before, for me, go hand in hand. And that's the second priority.
Thank you very much. I think I can release you. Have you said everything that you need to say from both a personal and a commission point of view at this third annual forum?
I have so much to say all the time, but maybe just the last thing is to thank the audience for their participation, for their active participation in the chat. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It has not even been 1 year since the last time we met here at the Endocrine Disruptor Forum. And I hope to see you again in the Endocrine Disruptor Forum, in the fourth Endocrine Disruptor Forum, which will take place in May 2022. Okay. So indeed, it will be before the summer. So we expect to see you all and have as good updates and as much activity as we have seen today. Thank you.
You may leave the stage while I, in 30 seconds, sign off. Thank you so very much for some immense hard work there, I think you will agree, and for also being able to pinpoint some of the most important messages and priorities at the very end. We know you are tired. You've been fantastic. It just remains for me to do the usual thing. Remind you, just in case you only happen to have turned up, that slides are available. A summary report is coming. You can tweet any words of wisdom at #Endocrine Disruptors. And of course, if there is any burning question and you need to speak with the Commission, env-edc@ec.europa.eu. Can I please thank again all our brilliant speakers, our extremely impressive interpreters. Good Lord, really impressive. All of our technical wizards behind the scenes, thank you very much. And of course, the European Commission, DG Environment, and we've had plenty of other representatives of other DGs here today. But thank you to the Commission for hosting and organising this event. It really has been a privilege to be among such brilliant minds for such stimulating discussions, genuinely. So I leave my small 2 penneth as the moderator, because there is so much to think about and to do. And you are all implicated actors. So I love these words of wisdom that come from the playwright and the political activist, George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So I would say in this entire ecosystem of stakeholders, you really need to make sure that you are making your voice heard and understood, and that you are listening to those who might not hold your position, because there's an awful lot of conversation out there on endocrine disruptors. That's it. You heard that the 4th annual forum is next May, so hopefully you can all join. Do spread the word before then. And in the meantime, thank you very much from your moderator, Katrina Sickle, at the Charlemagne Building in Brussels. Perhaps see you the next time.